This story begins with a young man living an ordinary life. He remained seated as he narrated that he was born in a house without any notable features. His days unfolded in a predictable way, within a monotonous and repetitive routine. Everything felt so emotionless that he imagined his existence would follow the same path, without any remarkable events. However, everything changes when he, with fascinated eyes, realizes he was wrong. Before him, he saw the image of a blonde young man who said that, after finding the destiny reserved for heroes, everything became different. On another uneventful day, he returned home after school, satisfied to be alone. He turned on the computer in an attempt to bring some sparkle to life, since school didn't interest him at all. What truly brought him satisfaction was playing a good game, enjoying the experience in solitude. In games, at least, he became the protagonist. If he wanted to use a special code to become an unbeatable champion with no obstacles, he had that freedom. Playing alone allowed him to save progress, restart at any moment, and move at his own pace. In his mindset, the world existed for a single player. However, at that moment, he chose to push such thoughts aside and focus on what truly interested him. As soon as he started the live stream, messages began appearing questioning his schedule. Right at the beginning, he received a donation of 10 and thought of quickly saying thanks. However, a new donation came in, this time worth 1,000, provoking an immediate reaction of surprise. He leaned closer to the screen, grabbing the monitor to make sure the amount was really what he had seen at first. Comments began piling up quickly, while some viewers mentioned it might have been a mistake. Noticing the arrival of an email, he opened his inbox to check its contents. In the email, a subscriber of the channel identified themselves as a game developer and mentioned that the recently launched project seemed excessively difficult, since no one had managed to finish the closed beta stage. The message ended with an enigmatic farewell, signed by someone who only called themselves D. Realizing no one had managed to clear the test phase, he reflected on the opportunity. He imagined that if he could complete the challenge, even someone ordinary could become special. After much thought, he decided to install the game, believing it wouldn't hurt to try. With the installation complete, all that remained was to start Destiny of Heroes. Upon entering the game, he found himself in a vast sea and noticed the graphics weren't as impressive as he had expected. However, knowing it was a project developed by a single person, he considered the simplicity acceptable. When prompted to enter a name for the character, the choice seemed obvious. He decided his avatar would be called Master of Games. As soon as he confirmed the name, he was welcomed into a forest setting, dressed in typical attire for the scenario. As he watched the screen, he noticed his character appeared pleased and also realized there was no initial tutorial. In the game, the character encountered a figure on the path. That individual was the village chief, and upon seeing the outsider, he questioned his presence there. Sitting before the screen, the young man watched the interaction without fully understanding what was happening. There were no visible options to reply, but something suggested he needed to come up with a response on his own. Feeling the nervousness rise, he pondered what to say and decided to improvise. He chose to pretend to be an outlaw and demanded all the gold coins, or else there would be consequences. After doing that, he waited for the reaction of the old man on the road. Contrary to what he imagined, the old man reacted in a rough and violent way, and as expected, his character in the game was eliminated. Now the game stated that he was eliminated and asked if he would like to restart. The player had barely interacted with the NPCs, and of course he wanted to restart. This time he used a different strategy. When the old man asked what he was doing in the village, he played innocent, saying he had been lost for many days and pleaded for the man's compassion. Seeing that the old man felt sorry for him and his appearance, he asked him to go on, thinking he had succeeded. The old man invited the young man into his house, prepared tea, and handed it to him. The old man warned that after drinking that beverage, the young man would get some rest. Unaware of what was happening, he drank it all in one gulp, but quickly felt his body acting strange. A notification stated he had been poisoned, dying a slow death, his eyelids growing heavy. And once again, the Master of Games was eliminated. However, the protagonist had an idea. Since he couldn't win, he would pull the internet cable. He thought that by disconnecting from the internet, the game's creator wouldn't be able to control the NPCs. When he restarted the game, the image of that village chief appeared somewhat distorted, and the notification arrived saying he had been eliminated again from Hemorrhage, after losing his tongue and talking nonsense. Frustrated, he threw the mouse, thinking that not even disconnecting the internet could make that thing stop. Now one question remained. Had he sent the game to the developer? All he knew was that it was called DEA, and it was the same name as the donor of the, was it the name of the development team? However, it was already 1:38 in the morning, and he was startled when he looked at the clock and saw how late it was. So he decided to save the game for the day. he figured that was enough. He was very excited to have managed to talk to an NPC. If the world of the hero's destiny really existed, it would be amazing. Now it made sense why no one saw the ending during the beta test period. With shining eyes, he thought everything was getting very interesting. After that, with the desire to become special, he kept playing for a long time. He dedicated himself so much that he even forgot time was passing, saving, storing, and starting over again. He was completely immersed in it for a very long time, until 10 years had passed. While at work, he heard someone call his name. It was a pretty red-haired girl who said she had prepared the documents he had asked for. He, now an adult, still wearing glasses and shy, thanked her. Looking at the clock, counting the seconds to leave, the redhead told him the work was done. He told her she had done a good job, but she just looked a little embarrassed. Even with that feeling, she approached him and asked if he wanted to have a beer and some chicken with her. She put on a sweet face to see if she could convince the guy. But apologizing, he said he had something very important to do and needed to go home. She, pretending everything was fine, said goodbye. He, all proper, said he needed to go and told her to go home too. As soon as he turned around, she was upset because she had been rejected again that day. When he got home, finally he could return to the hero's destiny, the place where he truly felt whole. After playing all night, he felt it was finally over. With a message on the screen congratulating him, saying he was the first human to conquer the lowest seat of the divine throne. He was beaming with joy, because he had finally finished the game he had played for over 10 years. His smile slowly faded until it turned into a sad face after playing for 10 years, trying to be special, even if only inside the game, but his life hadn't changed much. And now he had that empty feeling. What had filled him for 10 years was over. It felt like he had lived a double life all that time, and now one of them had come to an end. A flash of the characters he lived with for 10 years passed through his mind, like the Black Prince and the Cardinal. Like the dark witch behind the veil, charismatic characters full of personality. They were so real it was hard to distinguish them from actual humans. Tired, he thought this was really the end, until a message arrived. Trying to compose himself, he checked the message. It asked if he wanted to embark on a new adventure. However, it made clear that if he selected yes, he would be transported to the continent of Eren and could only return once it was completed. He imagined it could be a secret stage or perhaps a sequel. It didn't matter what it was. If he could feel that rush again, it would all be worth it. He felt like he needed to play again, so he decided he would accept the adventure. Quickly, he was transferred to the continent of Eren, and someone welcomed the master of the game. Now he felt like his chest was burning with fire. It was hard to breathe, but little by little he managed to open his eyes. He noticed he was in a room that wasn't his. Someone said he had woken up, and that was a relief. Someone in front of him said it was the potion they gave him. If it hadn't been of top quality, he wouldn't have seen the sunrise. Hearing this, the boy with blue eyes and golden hair opened his eyes, being called Prince Calyx. However, the protagonist didn't remember the man in front of him and, confused, asked who he was. The man stood with his mouth open, not knowing what to say. As far as he knew, that potion didn't cause memory loss. But when he looked at the protagonist, he saw that he was completely disoriented and clearly confused. The man, being kind, said he would introduce himself again. That was when he said his name was Russell. The strange thing was that the man wasn't speaking Japanese, yet the protagonist understood him perfectly. Oddly, he was feeling the same chest pain he had when he first woke up. Russell apologized and said it was his fault for rushing him. The chest pain was a side effect of taking it in a hurry. But he said he'd be fine soon, and for that reason, he would take his leave for now. With that, the door closed. While the protagonist remained still, a lot of time passed and a candle went out. So he opened his eyes again and got out of bed, trying to walk toward a mirror. Just as he had thought, the feeling in his body was different because his appearance had changed too. He started freaking out because he couldn't remember who he was. He remembered the 30 years he had lived, but didn't know his name. Staring into the mirror, he wondered if that world could really be him. That's when the friendly system appeared to help and said the player's name was Calyx Shezeson, the noble with no profession. He could see that the screen looked very similar to a game system interface. Now it made sense, that whole business of being sent to the continent. He was in the main stage of the entire game, the famous continent of Eren. Placing a hand on his chest, he said he needed to calm down first. Then he felt something strange coming from his chest, so he hit his chest again. And with that, he died in pain. That body of his was very fragile, and he didn't know exactly why. Now it was clear that this wasn't just a dream. First of all, he had to get used to being called by that name. Then he thought about the status window. It appeared again, and he figured that was the kind of thing only he could see. All in all, he was now 15 years old, and this was the perfect moment to gather information. He couldn't let his guard down in this world, or he'd be eliminated. He saw that he belonged to a county. He thought, wait, if the name of the place and his last name are the same, does that mean he's a direct heir of the family? But just as he was getting comfortable, someone knocked on the door, startling him, his heart racing. Now he didn't know how the real Calyx would react, so he kept repeating to himself that he was the guy. And the girl outside kept knocking. She was bringing tea. When he heard it was a maid outside, he decided to act with dignity. With that, the young woman entered the room, asking for permission. He watched her approach and kneel, and in front of him, she offered the medicine, saying the tea was warm and that he should try it. The young man, shy and suspicious, simply observed the girl, wanting to ask who she was. But he quickly realized that if he did that, it would be obvious he wasn't the real one. The girl thought he was staring at her and asked if something was wrong. Lucky for him, a system screen popped up above her head while he told her he was fine. The system showed that her name was Layla, 23 years old, with a reputation of -13 and very low fame. He noticed something that put him on high alert. She was affiliated with another territory. Considering they were in a different county, why was she affiliated somewhere else? Besides that, something was really strange. He noticed she had a very high combat ability. That was way too much skill for a simple maid. For him, who had played the game, he knew this kind of stat didn't belong to an ordinary servant. She kept staring at him directly, wanting him to drink in front of her. He wasn't exactly dumb, so he looked at the tea and quickly decided there was no way he was going to drink it. The girl noticed something was wrong and asked if he was okay, urging him to drink the tea. The protagonist thought she should just leave the tea and go, but the girl insisted. He saw that he had no other choice as he was being pressured, so he took the tea in his hand and examined it. The moment the tea was in his hand, he faked a sudden cough and let the cup slip from his hand. He saw the cup falling almost in slow motion and thought that, once the liquid hit the floor, he would be safe. Once it all spilled, she wouldn't be able to force him anymore. But then she dove and managed to catch the cup before it hit the ground, preventing the liquid from spilling. She walked up to him calmly, with the cup and the liquid in hand, while he was still frustrated, trying to understand the move she had just made in front of him. As she stood up, he lowered his head and looked away. She, holding the medicine on the tray, said again, relieved, that at least the medicine was safe. Meanwhile, he kept pretending, hoping he could avoid having to take that stuff. But he bent down again, trying to dodge the fact that he had to drink something he knew was poison. Closing his eyes, he thought he had to do something about this situation. When he pretended to collapse, she quickly rushed to his aid, holding him in her arms. Then, helping him sit up, she asked if he was okay now, and he wondered in his mind if the act had worked. Still in her arms and looking at the system, he wanted to know what kind of house that girl belonged to. First, he looked at his status and saw that he was the son of the Count's first wife, who had already died, and he also had a half-brother, the son of the second wife, who was 1 year older. Realizing that girl had been sent by the second wife, he understood their intentions. Since she was also a trained assassin, if he died, the stepmother's son would inherit the title of Count. In a way, he thought the game was getting interesting right from the start, putting pressure on him. So he decided to play along and told the girl he was feeling a little better. Smiling at her, he asked how his mother was doing. She found the question odd, phrased in an unusual way. Even so, she was a good player herself and said that the Countess was very worried about the young master being injured. With a serious expression, looking at that young woman, he realized the former owner of that body had tried to die. From the pain he felt in the status window, it looked like he had stabbed himself in the chest. He told the girl he understood and promised he wouldn't cause any more trouble. The girl replied that the Countess would be very pleased. Thinking he had gotten rid of the girl, he said she could leave now. However, with a dark look and an even darker voice, she reminded him that he hadn't taken his medication. That's when he realized there was no way out. If he didn't take it, she would handle him herself. His eyes widened. There was no other option. She was ready to force the medicine down his throat. She was a huge problem he needed to solve quickly, since she was an elite assassin. What could he do? He was just a 30-year-old man trapped in the body of a weak teenager. While her back was turned, he didn't know whether to scream for help, since his situation was complicated. But he knew that even if he did scream, no one would get there in time. He had seen her insane movements. He thought he had no choice but to drink it. Even so, he still tried to think positively, imagining she might just stab him and run away. As the girl approached with that medicine, he figured it out. She didn't want any witnesses. In that case, the poison was to cover up a murder, and without a doubt, its name was Slow Death. The girl was already close, telling him that if he was uncomfortable, she could help him drink it. Having played that game for 10 years, if there was one thing he had learned, it was that he should always imagine the worst, because it would soon become reality. If he wanted to survive, he had to distrust everything and always be prepared. If he stalled any longer, he didn't know what she might do to him. So he gathered strength and determination. Since the game demanded it, he would play by the hero's destiny. The girl, all smiles, brought the tray with the drink to him, saying he could drink it now. With no other option, he took the drink and swallowed it in one go. While being watched carefully by the girl, a message quickly appeared, informing him that he had been poisoned by Slow Death. Just as he suspected, Now he had to figure out a way to escape this situation. He remembered the man from earlier saying that if it hadn't been for the superior quality potion they had saved. He also remembered the man saying his name was Russell, and with that, his eyes widened. He thought the girl was going to call that man and bring him over. The girl tried to ask why, but the boy was furious and said he didn't owe an explanation to a servant. The girl realized she had been disrespectful and apologized for her rudeness. The boy shouted that she should leave his room immediately. He thought that the superior quality potion that man gave him was an elixir so expensive it was worth nearly a castle. While he was thinking that, the young woman left the room, and he thought that someone who wore such a treasure couldn't possibly be bad. Now alone, he figured that at the very least, she wasn't someone who wanted to harm him. He tried to get up and vomit as quickly as he could. He knew it wouldn't be enough. There had to be another quick solution. The game Destiny of Heroes was undoubtedly a hard one, but it never presented an unsolvable problem. That's why he believed the solution had to be somewhere. He couldn't believe there was no way out of this. The notification that his eyelids were getting heavy appeared. He knew from then on he had little time left. He started searching like crazy through the shelves or anywhere else that might offer a chance to escape. The message appeared again, saying his eyelids were getting very heavy. With that, he collapsed to the ground. It felt like his time had run out, and if that were the case, he didn't know if he could start over. But he had no idea. Maybe he'd die for real. His eyes were slowly closing, but on the floor, he managed to see something that seemed to bring him a bit of hope. It looked like a magic vial. The protagonist, realizing there was still hope as he saw that glowing flask before him, with his last bit of strength, managed to crawl toward that cabinet. He grabbed the vial, wondering what it was, and with trembling hands, managed to open it. He sniffed it to see if it had a familiar scent, but it had a disgusting smell. Something gross like completely spoiled milk. The system confirmed it was, in fact, spoiled goat milk. He remembered that at the beginning of the game, it was revealed that yogurt was the antidote to the slow death poison. Now he figured that spoiled goat milk might count as yogurt. Again, the message appeared saying his eyelids were getting heavy. He didn't have time to think. It was the third time he had received that warning, and each time he got weaker. He knew he couldn't hold on any longer, cursing the woman who gave him the poison, Layla, whom he wished with all his strength would suffer. He drank that disgusting stuff hoping it would make him better, and that someday he'd get revenge on her. Sometime after drinking the spoiled goat milk and opening his eyes again, he found himself once more facing that same man from before, Russell. He was asking if the young prince was feeling better. Now with his eyes open, he didn't know if he was having déjà vu or if the game had reset. But once he noticed, he didn't think twice and said something out loud, seeing the man in front of him look confused. There was nothing he could do because the man started yelling at him, asking what had happened to the room. Telling him to stop messing around, the man wanted to know why the young lord was sleeping on the floor. While getting scolded, the young man thought he never wanted to feel that fear of near death again. His goal was to survive, whatever it took. While thinking that, the man continued to scold him, and he thought that before anything else, he needed to do something. He needed strength to look at that man and check his status. Meanwhile, Russell kept yelling at the young master, asking if he was listening. Luckily, he managed to see the status of the man and noticed that he was the acting administrator. Now he thought that the count had died without naming a successor, and so Russell had taken over temporarily. Looking at that man, he thought he seemed like an honest and strict soldier, someone trustworthy. After all, he had saved him from death using a high-quality potion. He gathered the courage to speak to the man, asking if he was the acting administrator. The man stood alert, waiting to hear what the young master would request of him. Seeing that the young man said nothing, the man simply kept observing him seriously. In the meantime, the protagonist explained what had happened with the young woman who had offered him the medicine. The man listened in silence to every word the youth said, but in the end, he stated that there was no proof. With that, the protagonist widened his eyes, realizing that the man had only used the potion because it was the right thing to do. He wasn't on his side, as the youth had previously believed. The man explained that his duty was to serve both that master and the other successor candidate. Clenching his fists, the youth couldn't believe there were no witnesses or evidence. Angrily, he confronted Russell, asking if he was supposed to keep taking any medicine sent his way. The man regretted that the young master had lost part of his memory and explained that currently the county was in serious financial trouble and the budget was extremely limited, and that Layla's help, despite working for the other family, should be seen as something to be thankful for. But the man questioned how the young man didn't even remember that, or if he was deliberately ignoring it. Now the young man, with his head down, thought he would need to gather evidence to accuse the girl who had poisoned him. Seeing that he had no other choice, he told the man he would set that issue aside for now. Well, he had a request to make and asked if the man could grant it. Russell, saying nothing, only thought that the young man was acting strangely. After 4 hours in the Count's castle, someone skilled moved effortlessly from rooftop to rooftop, until the person landed where she intended. It was a woman wearing a cloak with her face covered. She observed that security had been significantly reinforced, but that didn't stop her. Looking for a quick way in, she found one, passed through a familiar area, and entered the room. When she reached the bedroom she wanted, she noticed there was no one guarding the door. Stealthily, she entered and looked at the bed, and based on the outline, she believed she had found her target. Looking that way, she thought the poison she had used was special. He would have gone without pain. After that, she pulled a piece of paper from her pocket and placed it on top of the desk. She grabbed the seal and stamped that piece of paper. Thinking everything was ready, she prepared to leave. That's when she felt a sharp object pointed at her neck and someone telling her to freeze. She immediately recognized that voice. Seeing she had been caught there, she was afraid of being executed. That's what she asked for, to have them wait a little. Angrily, she said it was already too late, then looked toward the bed where the prince was supposed to be. She said that young Master Calyx should already be dead, and now the clan would belong to the only remaining heir. And Russell, behind her, weapon in hand, observed the nonsense the girl had just said. She remained silent, gauging what his next move would be. With nothing to lose, she questioned him, saying she had sworn loyalty to an entire clan, not just to a young master. While Layla was still being held in place, she heard a voice and was stunned. Her eyes widened instantly, unable to believe that her plan had failed. That blond young man near the desk where she had written the farewell letter to him spoke with irony. He told her that slow death poisoning was a bit dramatic, but very common in noble family disputes. He, holding the paper, made it clear that even he knew that much. However, there was something she should also know: how problematic it was to be caught. With those words, she realized she was out of options and tried a quick attack on Russell. Even knowing the man was twice her size and 3 times as strong, she tried something. But she was immobilized moments later. He just abruptly grabbed her arm. She couldn't do anything since she was much weaker, and with him squeezing her arm, all she could feel was pain. To make things clearer for the girl, she had to take a punch or two to the ribs. While the young master observed and thought that he knew everything, in practice, theory was quite different. He saw the power of the man in front of him, who was 3 power classes above. Even so, he made himself present, saying that even if poisoning was common, no fool would leave evidence behind. And in her case, besides leaving evidence, she also left a witness, and the punishment for that was execution, even if it involved another noble. And now, here were gathered proofs along with a witness. And as he said that, he got very close to her, pointing his finger and saying that everything was right in front of her eyes. With that, she began to feel unwell. Her eyes rolled back, and she collapsed. The protagonist, looking at her collapsed on the floor, didn't understand what was happening. So he asked Russell what was going on with the girl who suddenly fainted. Russell confirmed that it was just that, a faint, and placed his hand over her mana flow to assess the situation. The young man thought that was the mana core, and with it, the man could also see Layla's class. Standing up, the man said it seemed she didn't know any mana breathing techniques. He continued, saying she was only at the level of a well-trained light soldier, so it wouldn't be necessary to use special restraints. Looking at the prince's face, he noticed he didn't show any signs of surprise. That led him to believe the young man already had an idea of what was going on, that he had known ever since he made that unexpected request. With that conclusion, the man decided he would now keep a closer eye on the prince's actions. All in all, the protagonist said that, regardless, he thought he should tie her up and interrogate her. Sometime later, the young woman appeared tied to a chair, still unconscious, and her arm had an abnormal swelling, but it was already being treated. After a few moments, Layla seemed disoriented as the young man wiped her face. Little by little, she began to open her eyes while her face was being wiped with a white handkerchief. When she finally regained full consciousness, her eyes widened quickly. She was even more surprised when the prince asked if she wanted to drink the most famous Chilean poison. Since, after 3 to 6 hours, the breathing would gradually stop, that poison was known for ensuring a peaceful death. Smiling with a strange voice, the protagonist told her that, based on her background, if they saw it, he would believe it was her own choice, when in truth, it was Layla who had the idea to use the slow-acting poison, because if she had used a fast one, if she were really willing to die with him, she wouldn't have failed. Tightening her chin, he asked if she knew why. She trembled, and he squeezed her face, wanting the answer since she had done that to him. The big man beside them simply watched how the prince handled the situation. He saw that the prince was coercing the girl more and more, asking her if she wanted to stay loyal and lose her life. And with that, he made it clear that he knew who was behind it. It was Countess Stella. Quite animated, the young man asked Russell if they could give her something to loosen her tongue. With that, he held the girl's mouth open while she looked at him approaching. She wanted to know what that was. He had a white handkerchief in his hand, and on it, a red pill. Without thinking much, he threw it into her mouth and asked the man to make her swallow it. All she could think was that the smell was horrible, and after that, he grabbed and poured some rotten goat milk into her mouth. He asked again for Russell to make her swallow it. As he forced it down, the girl squirmed in the chair. She thrashed around for a while. It seemed the taste was just as horrible as the smell. Layla shouted furiously, wanting to know what he had made her swallow, since the taste was disgusting. The prince laughed, saying he had given her poison as a kind of thank you gift. The young woman couldn't believe the prince was telling the truth, so he had to be more specific, saying he gave her a poison called puppet. He wanted to know if Layla had ever heard of it. She screamed from the chair, still tied, that it was impossible. He was just a spoiled little son of a count. He could never pull that off. But with threatening eyes, he said there's always a way. Mocking her, he said the main ingredient was white radish. She and Russell, upon hearing that, believed the young man was telling the truth. Now he simply stared at her, trying to figure out what else he could say next. Hearing what he said, she needed more answers, like how he even knew about that. But in a world without the internet, just knowing the right terms in the field was enough to pass as a specialist. After naming one of the ingredients, he told the young woman that he would let her go. Thinking about his plan, the prince said she could leave, but she wanted to know why he thought she would obey his orders. He made it clear that he knew she wanted, more than anyone, to stay alive. And besides, the poison she had taken had over 3,000 antidotes, depending on how it was used. And the antidote that worked for her was only with him. It was stored in his mind, in his memories. The young woman, while listening to the prince, still squirming in the chair, heard him make a bet that she wouldn't die for nothing. After that, the young woman stopped struggling while the young man asked what Layla's answer was. She knew she wanted to live and wouldn't throw everything away because of other people. While she remained silent, Russell observed the scene playing out between the two of them. Layla, completely hysterical, screamed that she would do anything. Just please let her go already. Hearing what she said, the prince just scoffed, saying that wasn't the way to ask for a favor. Trembling, she decided to be a bit more cautious, politely asking him to release her. Meanwhile, the man was still analyzing it all, wondering why the girl would suddenly obey the prince's orders so easily. Already feeling sick from having swallowed the spoiled goat milk, the girl begged for mercy, pleading to be released. Knowing the story, the prince figured she was desperate to get out, since the spoiled milk should be starting to take effect. With his cheeks already flushed from trying not to laugh, he asked the man to release Layla as quickly as possible. The man couldn't believe it and asked the prince if he was sure, since she had attempted to take his life. But it was fine. Despite her being an important witness, they needed to at least preserve her dignity as a human being. Russell heard the words coming from the prince's mouth, not understanding what he meant by that. Clearly feeling very unwell, the young woman begged that the man let her go immediately. Closing her eyes and nearly in tears, she just wanted to leave that place as quickly as possible, before she lost control. After a thunderous scream that echoed from one end to the other, she promised she would return and report her accomplishment with success. After saying those words, both the prince and the large man simply watched her leave. The prince knew that to fully deceive whoever was behind Layla, they would need someone capable of mobilizing the knights. For that, he counted on Russell's help, but he needed to know if the man was loyal to him. The man, however, had many questions to ask the young one. He wanted to know where he had acquired so much knowledge. Hearing that, the protagonist considered saying he had read it in a book, but figured the man wouldn't believe it. And that's exactly what happened. He didn't believe anyone would publish a book like that, as they'd have their head on the chopping block. At no point had the prince considered that such a book could be banned, so he didn't believe it and decided to come up with another excuse. That's when he thought to ask if he remembered the dagger with which he had stabbed his own chest. With a serious and stern tone, the man said he remembered, but there was no need to keep bringing that up. However, for him to understand everything, the prince needed to bring up the dagger again. Russell couldn't believe the prince had said that dagger was a mystical item with rare powers. Looking at the man, the young one realized it wasn't enough. He had to embellish the story further, so he argued that maybe the way to unlock the dagger's secret was by stabbing one's own heart. That made the man curious, and he believed it might be an incredible treasure. The protagonist closed his eyes, relieved. Opening them again, now with a more resolute look, he was aware that the man might be on his side. He said what the man should have already heard. "Have you ever heard of the dagger of Kriya?" The man said yes, that it was an old dagger left by his mother, the famous dagger of Kriya. Watching the reaction to each word the man absorbed, the prince knew he was falling for his tale, so he kept going with some freedom. The man said that dagger was the greatest of treasures, so it made sense he had knowledge of it. The prince knew the man had already seen the dagger in front of him, but continued pretending otherwise. While the man tossed out his theories on how it might have happened, he angrily asked if he had told anyone else about it. Russell only calmed down after hearing the young master repeat that he had never told anyone and that he was the first. However, there was another matter the boy wanted to talk about. He asked the man what he thought of Layla's testimony. Then he dropped a bomb on Russell when he said that all of Count Colin's movements had been leaked. Without letting the man react, the young one questioned the credibility of a Class 7 person being attacked by monsters. Quickly, he fired a question at Russell, wanting to know if he believed such a ridiculous story. The man, just by looking at the slumped youth, already knew he wanted his full support. The man hesitated for a while, because Count Colin's death did raise some legitimate doubts. Even so, the man paused for a moment, then brought his hands to his chest. He knew he was a soldier, not a politician. He was ready to say that to the young man when the latter sharply demanded answers. However, that man didn't have the answers to soothe the heart of the orphaned young prince. Seeing that it wouldn't be enough, the prince launched another question at the man, wanting to know how he would get revenge. To the question the man couldn't answer, the young master wanted to know why his father had been eliminated. He stated clearly that his father had been eliminated and that the Kosala family could be behind it all. However, it was a fact that if Granbingi became count, the prince would never be able to take his revenge. After demanding some answers from the man, he simply went silent. Minutes later, he cast a meticulous gaze in Russell's direction, questioning his loyalty as a knight. It was clear that each word felt like 1,000 arrows aimed at that man, who could do nothing more than fall to his knees, supported by his sword, swearing loyalty. The young prince told Captain Russell that someone like him didn't need to offer loyalty. However, the man looked at him with eyes full of sincerity and asked him never to forget what he was giving up. It wasn't easy to abandon a belief he had upheld for over 60 years, yet all the young man understood was that he had this man by his side. Now at last he would put the reins of vengeance around the neck of the tiger that had always walked its own path. Asking the man to rise, he said it was an honor to receive the loyalty of a swordsman. The prince was startled when the man, with an excited look, said he would make him strong. He began to fear that the man wanted to train him. Later they talked about how the countess was treacherous, and now that she had left behind evidence and witnesses, they could take down her faction. This would be the beginning of vengeance. Having drawn the attention of this man to another matter, Russell now wanted to know what he could do to help the prince. With a slight smile, the protagonist said he would think about the first step, and with that, the two revealed the plan. Time passed, and now we are in a great hall. A meeting led by the countess was beginning. She wanted to know if everyone had already gathered. Many were wondering why the countess was sitting on the count's throne. Smiling with her red fan, she said that many should already know that, the night before, young Master Calyx had once again attempted to take his own life, and this time had drunk a deadly poison. One of the guests wanted to know if it was the slow-acting poison, since it was a very well-known one. It was best not to expect that he had survived. In truth, one of the guests declared that now that the firstborn son was gone, the factions no longer had any meaning. At that moment, she thought about how good it felt to remove that obstacle from her path. And to many, it had become clear that Granbingi would be the next count. Even so, the protagonist, who was already settled somewhere nearby, thought the question was far too obvious. Clearly, the countess would act as regent. Still, the story was becoming interesting. It was like that when the voice told him everything was ready. He glanced and saw it was Russell, the one who had said that, even if it took him to hell, he would follow him. He was already dressed in knight's armor, and once again stood by his side as a loyal squire. Meanwhile, in the meeting, the countess, with her extravagant fan, looked at her son with pride. While she dreamed that he would become the next count, the door was kicked open, and in walked the last person they expected. The prince was alive and entered that meeting uninvited. This left the countess furious. Stammering, she could barely pronounce Calyx's name as he walked in calmly with his loyal squire. The red cape he wore contrasted with the countess's extravagant fan. In a fit of rage, she demanded to know what was going on, followed by others asking how the young master was still alive. And they also wanted to know why the acting administrator was on his side. The countess had many questions to answer. However, the young man shouted at her that the place she was sitting in was not fit for a common woman. For a moment, the countess tried to remain calm, thinking she could still come out on top of the situation. But the smile on the young man's lips showed she wouldn't be able to weasel her way out this time. He made it clear that because of someone, he drank the poison, but luckily survived since he vomited right after. He told her that it seemed she had been a little too hasty. She could only stammer. Defending herself, she said the young man should stop talking like that. Anyone listening would think she had tried to poison him. Even though he had never recognized her as a mother, she would never do something so vile, and the accusation couldn't go unanswered. She screamed that they were in the great sacred hall. This was a public space where he would have to take responsibility. Laughing out loud, the young man told her that she'd better still feel so confident when the truth came out. The woman, now completely unhinged, couldn't understand how he was maintaining such a firm attitude. The young man kept mocking her the entire time until, at one moment, he decided to clap his hands. And after that sound, someone tied up entered the hall with their head down. The prince asked that everyone pause for a moment to listen to what the witness had to say. With that, the countess's guests wondered who that woman was, walking slowly with her head lowered. However, the countess already knew who it was. She could barely believe that the young woman had been caught. Now the young woman kneeled in front of everyone, and the protagonist ordered her to say her name so that all would know. That young woman, with a sorrowful look, could barely stammer her name until she finally said it was Layla. She was now looking directly at a young man in blue garments with a large frame. It happened quickly. Her eyes widened. She couldn't believe that wretched woman was there. Her face clearly showed the hatred she felt upon seeing the young woman. And with that woman's gaze fixed on the kneeling girl, she declared that she was a first-class agent. When the protagonist heard that the girl was part of the organization known as the Shadow Corps, he was intrigued. Then the young woman explained that it was a special force that gathered orphans with talent for combat. In that place, only exceptional children survived and were selected to be sent to various locations. While the Duchess trembled, the protagonist asked the girl what her false identity was within the Count's territory. The young woman revealed that she had posed as Countess Estella's maid. The blonde young man with blue eyes looked at his stepmother and asked the girl if the Countess was aware of these details. She, still kneeling and with her head bowed, confirmed that she knew everything. Hearing such accusations, the Countess couldn't stay calm and claimed it was all part of a conspiracy. Many of the guests were stunned, since Layla had worked there for over 5 years. Now everyone was terrified, knowing that among them had been a spy sent by the Kosala family for years. They questioned what to do now, since the problem was that they had a witness. The questions began to target Viscount Russell, with many wanting to know why he remained silent. They asked if he could really be trusted based on the words of a maid. That's when he spoke up, looking directly at the person, saying she was not a mere maid, but a criminal. Kilix, hearing the man's words, maintained a look of boldness mixed with relief. Russell continued firmly, saying that whether it was a conspiracy or not, it wasn't up to anyone to judge without first hearing the testimony. Others also demanded the chief treasurer to shut his mouth and stop speaking nonsense. That upset the man, as he wanted to protect the Countess at all costs. Everyone needed to be quiet and listen to the criminal, since she was confessing her crimes. The treasurer looked at the Countess, realizing there was nothing he could do. While the girl continued to be interrogated, they discovered what her assigned mission had been. With the Countess's eyes locked on the scene, the girl continued saying that once a month, she reported the information she had gathered. The blonde young man asked her what kind of information she provided. She said mostly financial records created by the chief treasurer about the territory's income and expenses, as well as the schedule and travel routes of the late Count Colin. As she spoke, Russell's face was becoming more and more sinister, yet the girl continued her account. Clearly, her words were bothering the big man, but he had pledged loyalty and needed to stay close to the boy. The blonde young man continued asking about the girl's most recent mission. She said she had tricked Prince Calix into drinking the poison known as slow death. She recounted how she then entered his room to plant a forged farewell letter. The young man, staring at the girl, asked her what the final result was. The young woman said, while Estella squirmed with rage, that she had managed to poison him, but when she entered his room, she was caught by Regent Russell. By that point, the Countess could no longer hear anything. Desperate, she shouted that there must be proof, some kind of evidence, and said this while trying to lunge at them. However, the blonde young man with blue eyes had the very proof she demanded, and for that, he asked Regent Count Russell to present it. The man revealed the forged letter, written in Layla's handwriting, pretending to be a dramatic farewell from Prince Calix. With the letter in hand, he said that the previous night, he had caught Layla sneaking into the room. While she was planting the fake letter, what he had in his hand was the scroll of the land's memory. Of course, everyone was already familiar with the scroll. It was enchanted with magic that revealed malicious intent, as he explained that the scroll would show who had given orders to Layla and that the truth would be exposed. The treasurer looked at his accomplice, thinking they needed to stop that evidence from spreading. Other co-conspirators also believed they needed to silence everyone present. Kilix, looking at certain people, already knew that rot had taken hold, and he was ready to make a move. Extending his hands, he asked them to come in. The more he spoke, the more the treasurer grew worried. Suddenly, that meeting was swarmed with royal guards, and each of them was stationed behind someone at the meeting. So when the truth was revealed, no one could escape. Even the Countess had a royal guard right behind her. The stage was set, ensuring the true conspirators would not get away. Very uneasy, the treasurer asked Viscount Russell what was going on. So he decided to answer the treasurer, saying he had already reviewed the contents of the scroll, and they had been shocking from the beginning. The knights had only been summoned to prevent chaos, and for that reason, he asked for everyone's understanding. Even in that situation, the Countess thought that bringing the evidence into the sacred hall could only be proof of a coup. The Countess's son was now trembling, afraid of what might come next. Estella knew that the fact neutral knights were taking action meant there was undeniable evidence. She could not allow the knights to officially support Calix, because if he gained that support, there would be nothing more they could do. Smiling, the cunning player asked the regent count what the punishment was for a noble who conspired against their own blood. It was answered that the person who broke such a law would be given a rope necklace to place around their neck. The crazed woman clutched her son, saying that Grandbingy knew nothing. She told Calix that even though she had no blood ties to him, she still considered herself his mother. At that, the young man only looked at her with his blue eyes, saying nothing, while she begged him to believe her words. Hearing those words with a hint of amusement, the young man asked Layla if what the Countess said was true. The girl, with little expression in her eyes, said that when she received the Countess's order, at the time Prince Gambini was also present, and hearing those words, a smile immediately spread across his face. It seemed like it was exactly what he wanted to hear. After those words, the woman snapped and screamed that it was a lie. She held her son as if trying to shield him from the world. To Calix, who watched as a guard restrained the Countess, he knew she had paved her own way to this moment, and now she was reaping what she had sown, just like a cunning fox, just like her son, who now wore an expression of regret. At that moment, the protagonist had the look of someone adapting well to the game. The situation had changed, and now the Countess was being restrained in front of everyone. Unable to control himself, Gambini slammed his hands forcefully on the table and shouted the protagonist's name. Amid the clamor, he looked toward the noisy young man. Now having Calix's attention, he could face him boldly. The Countess, fearful of what her son might do and how he might react, cried out his name. This situation also caught the protagonist's attention, who turned to look in her direction. Then he turned back and looked again at Gambini, who, in an unexpected gesture, knelt before his brother, startling everyone. He had a different expression, as if compelled to act quickly. However, several people stood up, feeling it was wrong for him to kneel before Calix. The young man begged, saying it didn't matter what was done to him, but to spare his mother's life. The Countess only raised her head slightly to try to see what her son was doing. Desperate, she began to scream for her son to return to his place immediately. People at the meeting murmured among themselves that this was all going too far. They said that even if the second prince kneeled before Calix, he shouldn't listen to him. With that unexpected move by the second prince, the protagonist realized that he was now being seen as the villain. And now, looking at that chubby young man before him, he began to wonder if he had planned everything. That's why he clenched his teeth in anger. He didn't quite know what to do. He decided to trust his many years of experience with that game, bent down toward his brother, and said it was okay, that he couldn't ignore Gambini. This filled his brother's face with hope. Then the protagonist told him that those who admitted their mistakes deserved a reduction in punishment. With that move, the protagonist was aiming to make him confess to everything. And before his brother could say anything, he warned him that the words spoken could not be taken back. Putting that young noble in a tight spot, stammering, he said he couldn't accept things that way. As soon as he said those words, his mother immediately asked what he was doing and told him to stop with that nonsense. She also mentioned that Calix was nobody to be giving orders to his older brother. The people who were there were furious, believing she could no longer even consider the two as brothers. The old treasurer didn't understand why she was doing this. The tide had finally turned in their favor, and now the Countess kept cursing the young noble before her. Still, the boy didn't need to say much. In fact, he said nothing at all, just looked at the Viscount and pointed. With that, Russell gave the order for 2 soldiers to arrest the guilty parties immediately. The woman, increasingly unhinged, screamed that they couldn't lay a hand on her or her son. While the young man could do nothing, he only thought that he should have saved his mother. And to silence the woman's sharp tongue, she had to be gagged. Now her son simply closed his eyes, listening to his mother's murmurs, yet remained kneeling before his brother. The protagonist announced that he would ask again if the boy admitted to the crime of attempting to poison him. Gambini was irritated, baring his teeth, but he had to say something. With no other option, he said he admitted it. The protagonist noticed he did it only because he had no choice. After all, if he kept resisting, even the sympathy he had earned would vanish. So the protagonist asked if Gambini had planned everything. While the blonde youth spoke, Russell merely observed the expressions of the boy before them. Then, at a certain point, the protagonist declared that he would keep the scroll of the land's memory a secret, because it could stain the family's honor. He also said the young man had confessed, so he would reduce the sentence. He added that, as proof he would not contest the decision, the young man should seal his mana core himself. Gambini hadn't imagined things would go this far. This was the kingdom of Roke, the land of knights. There, society was rigidly divided between nobles, knights, commoners, and even slaves. And the only way to become part of the ruling class, the knights and Manhuas, was by strengthening the body. That was why sealing one's mana core was considered a social death. So the young man received the news with bitterness, but when he looked at his mother, he realized he had no other way out. He wanted her to find a way to stop all this, but she couldn't speak. He knew that if he didn't seal his core, his mother's crime would be exposed, and she would be duly punished. So he had to try to stop it at all costs. The Countess struggled, making it difficult for the soldiers to keep her restrained, and they asked her to stay still. In her thoughts, she begged her son not to seal his mana core, for it would be the same as condemning the noble to death. Nonetheless, the young man took a deep breath, and looking at his brother, said he would keep his promise. Russell was the one who guaranteed that the promise would be upheld. The boy placed the scroll in his mouth and his hand on his mana flow. With that, the procedure began. While his mother lost her mind, praying he wouldn't go through with it. She knew that with a sealed core, not even a grandmaster could reopen it. It was his future on the line. Even so, he continued carrying out the act, while the young noble watched his every move. Still holding the scroll with his mouth, he used both hands to manipulate his energy core. He managed to control it so that it slowly diminished as the process continued. Until the core was sealed, everyone watched when it happened. The Countess burst into tears, unable to believe something so terrible had really happened to her son. Granbini looked at his mother and thought that now he might be able to save her, since he had done his part in the agreement. And she, sorrowful, thought that now everything was truly over. Though he was her son, he didn't understand much about the world. As he turned to her, he tried to show he wasn't all that sad. He even told her not to be so upset, that in truth, he had always wanted to be an artist. His words didn't calm her as he had hoped. She grew even more furious. In that fit of rage, she managed to break the restraints holding the gag in her mouth. And so she got what she wanted. She cursed the protagonist, saying she would curse him for the rest of his life. While she hurled harsh insults and threats, he knew that without a core, he could, at most, reach level 3. If he was extremely successful, he might reach Layla's level, but no further. Seeing his mother in a fit of madness, he went to her, trying to calm her down so things wouldn't get worse. Witnessing what was happening, the protagonist felt disturbed, unsure if it was guilt for having taken the future of someone who was still just a student. No matter how it was, he couldn't afford to feel pity. He knew they were characters in a game. While he was moved and tried to hold himself back, Russell watched and found his behavior strange. But all of that was brief. The protagonist quickly regained his composure, knowing that either way, he couldn't go back. He asked the acting administrator, Russell, to finalize the purge. Everyone in that great hall remained silent as the son tried to comfort the Countess. The Viscount announced that Countess Estela and Prince Granbini would be confined in the annex until the investigations were concluded. Both would be forbidden from leaving or having contact with anyone outside. With his head down, Granbini simply walked past Calix and left with his mother, being taken away by the guards. The blonde-haired, blue-eyed young man looked back for a moment. Quickly, it was time for the chief treasurer Gidros, who was accused of leaking confidential documents. He would be stripped of his position and imprisoned for investigation without mercy, and the Viscount ordered the prisoner to be taken away. Gidros shouted that it wasn't up to them to detain him, yelling while a low-ranking soldier held him, and he kept provoking the guard's wrath until he earned himself a certain lesson in good manners. In the midst of the scuffle, the chief treasurer's wig fell off, and now he was being taken away with his shiny bald head exposed. The protagonist didn't feel even a bit of pity for him. Now everyone else looked on, afraid they'd end up like Gidros. As the young man observed, people thought about the fact that the prince hadn't even had political backing. They whispered among themselves that having the support of someone as influential as Russell meant the entire Night Order was on his side. They knew the succession dispute had already been pre-decided. Russell was acting humbly, in front of everyone, but that was a warning from Prince Calix to them all. The next to be called was the captain of the guard, who was told he was suspended from his duties and should avoid contact with others for a while. That decision from the Viscount startled everyone. Bowing, Garrod admitted the blame was entirely his for being negligent, so he resigned from the position. The protagonist thought that man was respected by his subordinates, and had already arranged with Russell that they wouldn't be too harsh on him, which is why the Viscount didn't accept his resignation. A list was delivered containing names of administrators suspected of involvement in the case. The head of administration was tasked with suspending them and preventing any disruption in operations. After being told to ensure everything continued functioning, that man apologized. Russell noticed something was off with Prince Calix, who quickly summoned the acting administrator, stating that all treasurers, except for 4 under investigation, should send new treasurers to the Treasury Department. The head of administration pleaded with the prince on behalf of those who were less guilty. He believed that if too many were removed, there'd be no staff left and operations would face serious issues. However, the protagonist knew it was necessary to have absolutely trustworthy people handling the finances, and it was unacceptable to halt investigations out of fear of operational gaps. And they would also be thankful for the show of generosity or feel even more confident. The head of administration, after hearing what Prince Calix had said, believed that perhaps the people in question had chosen the wrong side, and it was precisely because of that that the protagonist was sure it was enough. In a serious tone, he declared the decision complete. Meanwhile, that man observed the figure before him and was certain that this person seemed completely different. Before, he had been indecisive and had a fragile heart. And at the table, people debated. Since Russell was the symbol of military power, Garrod was the symbol of administration. But they noticed that even he was panicking in front of the young man and didn't know how that was possible. Watching how things were going, he knew the county was practically his. Besides that, he had the power of information about people, a stat window that gave him access to important details. And by looking at the information of the minor baron, who held the position of head of administration, he knew he was a strict advisor. And it wasn't just his information, but anyone's in that room, he had total access. To him, the game was becoming more and more interesting, and so he wore a wide smile. With the blondie surrounded by various status screens, he could easily know who he was dealing with. At first, he imagined dealing with the administrator might be tricky, but he was proving to be predictable. And people like that weren't complicated, which is why he would completely eliminate the opposing faction, and also those who sat on the fence, the ones who seemed useless. He would make them compete for loyalty, and only he would use the ones who remained in the end. Everyone looking at the boy didn't know what his smile meant at that moment. Some were even afraid. They knew that if they angered Prince Kelix, they could lose even their heads, and everything was going exactly as he had planned. Everyone was all over him like bees on honey. After seeing that everything was going well, he asked everyone to calm down, since the League still had plenty of time. From a distance, the Viscount simply watched, trying not to form any thought. After a long and tiring day, night came and the player was exhausted. That stage had really been exciting. Lying in his big, soft bed, for a moment he thought about how, in real life, he was nothing more than average. With average studies, looks, and life, trying to be special, he found that game. And there he could be more special than anyone else, even earning recognition from the game. He was the first human to conquer the lowest rank of the Divine Throne, and just when he thought everything was over, the system asked if he wanted to be reborn in the continent of Erin. If so, he could live as someone who wasn't average. Now his eyes were wide open. Lying in bed, he stared at the ceiling and thought about the Divine Throne. Now what he truly desired was to complete the game and conquer the Divine Throne, which made him remember the beginning. He had been born into a small and insignificant soul, needing to survive the chaos and become a hero. By doing so, he would defeat resurrected evil gods and ascend to the Divine Throne, making any of his wishes possible. Now he was remembering when he was a mediocre person and had made that wish after beating the game. That was the question. Had the system interpreted a venting moment as his wish? Lying back down and hugging his pillow, he decided that either way, he couldn't turn back. He would complete that world and ascend to the Divine Throne again. Maybe that way he could make another wish. Even if he couldn't make another wish, he would still finish it. Since he was so tired, he quickly fell asleep, and when the new day dawned, he was already up and ready. Now he just needed to know where to start. He knew all the candidates. So the fact was that he had never heard of the Dice of Shitasen, and because of that, he didn't know exactly where it was. Full of doubts, he stood before the map and went to check where he was. He noticed he had already conquered the continent of Erin, and the reward was that all the map merchants would now be revealed. He was satisfied. It was like a treasure map. All the landmarks, dungeons, and relics of the hero's destiny were on the map. That reward could complete the game no one knew, because no one had ever made it to the end. It was the revelation of all the map merchants. Now all the information he never had would be there. Lying on the couch, he even rolled around with joy, thinking that now it would be a breeze. But he needed to know what year it was. He checked and confirmed they were in the Imperial Year 289. The hero's destiny ended in the Imperial Year 294, which left him a bit disappointed, and he began to think about why he had never heard of that contact. The momentary joy turned into uncontrollable rage. The reason was that the territory he had fought so hard to conquer was going to disappear. He remembered Russell mentioning something about financial problems, and that's why they had nearly died, because they couldn't afford to hire a servant. He thought maybe he should check the financial status, since it was right in front of him. He wondered why this was all happening suddenly, but what he saw made his eyes widen again. With a stern expression, he thought it was all unbelievable. He remembered that status. He didn't know whether he should gather all the remaining money and flee, but he couldn't take the land with him. He thought money could always be earned again, but land could only be acquired by lineage. He had worked so hard to obtain that territory, it would be a waste to abandon it. After looking at the county's finances, he saw that the taxes collected from the farmland weren't much different from other territories. Now he was analyzing the territory's debts. He spent a long time on it, lost hours examining and plotting a strategy. It was as if that process was draining even his soul, reviewing 10 years of data all at once. Still, the biggest problem was that trade with the desert kingdom of a certain drug, beyond the plateau, had been cut off. He couldn't prevent the drop in tariffs due to the breakdown of trade between nations. He also saw that they were buried under a mountain of loans to repay. The annual interest was higher than the tax revenue of an entire year. From that point on, the numbers were just statistics. He would need more information to be able to build a strategy. The idea surged through his mind like a shockwave. He remembered he had a filthy pig locked in the underground prison. He was thinking about the former chief treasurer. He was heading down to meet him. He was going to press him for information. The guard was startled when he saw the prince and asked what he was doing there. The protagonist ordered the guard to take him to Gidros' cell, and the guard immediately showed the way. For a brief moment, he had to cover his nose. The stench was far too strong. As they walked, the guard commented, saying he never thought he'd see Prince Calyx in a place like that. Soon, the protagonist figured out that the man was on the captain of the guard's side. He had a habit of bowing to those in power. The prince knew what had to be done. In cases like that, he paused, letting the man take notice of him. And when the man also stopped, the protagonist spoke up, saying the captain of the guard was a man who surrendered too easily to power, that there was an innocent prisoner brought in by mistake, and he deserved a chance to clear his name. The guard was delighted and said he thought that was absolutely right. But he continued, saying that on the other hand, they should also review cases where dangerous criminals had been released. That matter would fall under the responsibility of the prison warden. In this way, the protagonist successfully manipulated the man. Looking at that guard, the protagonist could barely believe someone like him had served under the captain of the guard. However, the prince told him he wasn't the commander yet and should watch how he addressed him. He had become just like the politicians he always despised and said there was no need to apologize. The man continued showing the way, and within moments they arrived at the cell. However, the prisoner was complaining about the disgusting food that had been served to him, and when he claimed he'd be out of there soon, the protagonist wanted to know how he planned to do that. With a mocking expression, he asked if he was planning to escape. The man returned the sarcasm in his gaze and said he was waiting for the prince, leaving him intrigued by saying that he had finally remembered the debt he owed him. Bending down, the prince asked if the prisoner had gone insane, as he clearly remembered no debt owed to that man. And while dealing with the prisoner, he made it clear to both him and the warden who was in charge, because the old man had served as chief treasurer of the county for over 20 years. And the man knew that was exactly why the prince was there. He was curious. Since he had discovered the county's massive debts, the furious protagonist addressed the man as ex-treasurer. The old man insisted the young prince was there to understand the massive debt of the county. All the protagonist could do was stare at that insolent pig, while the same pig looked back at him with mockery and disdain. However, the protagonist was no beginner player. He asked the prison warden something. He wanted to know if there was anyone there skilled enough to extract the truth from a prisoner. The prison warden was stunned by the prince's question, but he had to reply that yes, there was, and he was immediately ordered to fetch that person. As the warden left, the prince looked at the old man and asked if he really thought he had come there to play games. He told both of them to listen. He wasn't there to tell jokes or be funny for anyone. The prison warden felt fear run through his veins and said he'd call the person immediately, then ran off. As that warden ran, he thought that because the prince was young and inexperienced, he could be easily manipulated. But that young man was strong and determined. He was true power in the county. Not only did the prison warden realize this, but the treasurer also knew that someone skilled had been summoned. Regardless, the prince said that no matter how much the man could endure or how long it would take, he would stay and wait, and in any case he would do his best. The prince seemed to be emphasizing to the man just how much pain he would feel. He concluded by saying that maybe, if he showed a little remorse, the execution could be exchanged for a drink called slow death. When the ex-treasurer looked into the young man's eyes, he realized he was dead serious. Seeing that things could get really bad for him, he screamed that he had valuable information worth money. The prince thought that if he wanted to start that way, he should have said something from the beginning. The old man said that if they handed the guy over to the royal family, they wouldn't have to pay the debts anymore. Angry, the prince demanded to know what he meant. He suspected the man had sold the debts at a low price before being arrested. The prince wanted to know if it was to the Kosala family itself. The man was terrified, as he had never thought about it that way before. Meanwhile, the prison guards arrived running with a specialist in the field. It was a man with a sinister aura, masked, and he seemed to be the best in the entire county. The protagonist was glowing with excitement when he saw the so-called specialist arrive. The old man looked like he was trembling over something bad. He began shouting to the prince to have mercy on him and mentioned something about a secret fund Gerard managed for the Kosala family. He yelled that it exceeded at least 100,000 gold coins. That information caught the protagonist's attention. However, Calyx shook his head, showing no mercy for the man, and he looked favorably at that specialist while the old treasurer trembled. It took a while, but once it sank in, the boy wanted to know more about this secret vault. Meanwhile, the specialist had already entered the cell and asked the prince for just a moment. After punishing the old man a little, since the specialist was feeling a bit thirsty, it was confirmed that the man's information was true. He said he had worked in the treasury for decades. Calyx wanted to know how he had found out about the secret vault. The man didn't seem willing to say, but the skilled specialist was delicately massaging his fingers, which made the old man feel the urge to talk. He admitted that once he tried to take the vault for himself, but failed. The prince found it outrageous that a chief treasurer would try to steal someone else's treasure. The shameless old man even said he didn't try to take it, he just paid people to do it. The prince wanted to know when he funded the agents and how much he paid. He said it was around 3,000 gold coins to a lunatic. The prince could hardly believe such a high amount was paid for pigs who couldn't even do the job. Furious, the protagonist demanded that he repeat if that was the same amount he had just heard. The old man said nothing, though he thought he was ruined. Inside the cell were 3 men, the prison chief, the specialist, and the old man getting a hand massage. They saw when the prince went completely mad. He was so furious he wanted to laugh. With a sinister aura, the prince stated that amount was half the county's annual revenue. He wanted to know where that money had come from. He concluded the man had taken it from the county's coffers. The man, while receiving some body massages, claimed he had no other option since his secret vault didn't have a magical orb. Listening to the old man's words, the protagonist realized he didn't know about this so-called magical orb. He asked the old man to explain it properly. The man, who had already been getting a certain kind of massage for a while, explained it would take 2,500 gold coins to make a copy of the orb. Even hearing such nonsense, the protagonist felt he was getting somewhere. Looking at that old man deprived of any intelligence, he told him he'd been tricked. He said it was likely that the swindlers and Gerard were working together. The old man shouted that he had seen the vault's entrance with his own eyes. He saw Gerard open the door using the magical orb. With a serious tone, the prince wanted to know where that place was. The old man said it was in the Golda Plateau. Sadly, he said he had been blindfolded on the way there, so he didn't know the exact location, but he was certain it was on the Golda Plateau. With that information, the protagonist paused for a moment and opened the map only he could see. Meanwhile, the 3 in the cell kept watching the prince look into nowhere and confirm a few things. The protagonist was actually observing the Golda Plateau and checking the distance between it and the county. He knew there were ruins and thought he understood enough. Information about the surrounding ruins was like a riddle. However, he felt he needed to investigate a little more, perhaps if he found someone who knew the Golda Plateau. Then he remembered Layla's words, saying they gathered orphans with combat talent and took them to the Golda Plateau. With that memory, it seemed like he had a better expectation of how to resolve things. An angry voice called out to the prison chief, saying he was leaving. The chief left everything to properly escort the prince, while the old man kept calling for him. Now that he was left alone with the specialist, so excited, you could hear his screams while the prince walked away. As he left, the prince looked back and thought that Dan Pig had kept 3,000 gold coins. And it was obvious that the guard captain had accepted a bribe from that pig. The more he thought about it, the angrier he got. Turning to the prison chief, he didn't want that scoundrel to go unpunished. Gidris also deserved something harsher. That was his thought. He called the prison chief once more and said they had just discovered that Gidris had kept a significant sum. He clearly asked if he didn't know that. The man, with a guilty look, said he wasn't sure. However, he thought there was no way the prince could know he had accepted a small bribe. With his back turned to the man, he said that, when he left for a moment, Gidris had told him something interesting. That made the guard go pale, but he still looked at him, saying he was generous, but he didn't know to what extent. There were things he could not ignore. This was quite the dilemma. With those harsh words, the prison chief collapsed to the ground, begging the prince for mercy. And when he knelt down, he thought that man shouldn't have reported him just because he stepped out for a moment. The man shouted that he was wrong and that it would never happen again. He begged the prince for mercy. He rolled his eyes upward to see the prince's reaction, only to notice he was no longer there. Now he was so furious he would deliver the kind of severe punishment the prince had always wanted. He stormed off, determined to show that old man the true face of a penitentiary. Meanwhile, the protagonist was simply hiding, watching the prison chief's reaction the whole time. He seemed delighted to be hidden and watching everything unfold, but while in hiding, he sensed a strange presence. He turned and saw a silhouette, but he didn't recognize who it was yet. It startled the prince, who was watching the prison chief from behind a well, and he immediately asked who was there. The young man just kept watching. However, the protagonist quickly checked the person's status to gather information. He realized the man was a knight, but more skilled than he had expected. He just didn't know why he'd never heard of him before. The young man's level cap was 70, probably capable of reaching the level of the continent's top 100 warriors. Moreover, it was rare to find someone with A-rank military skills. The protagonist pondered over him. He thought the man could be a demon who, despite his merciful demeanor, slaughtered without leaving a single enemy alive, someone known as the Herald of Death. But he quickly shook his head to push away that strange thought. The Herald of Death was described as slim and shadowy, whereas this man was muscular and completely different. Above all, his eyes were far too clear. For now, he didn't have enough information to dwell on such things. Based on the young man's potential, he was at least A-rank, and having him on his side would only benefit the protagonist. While lost in thought, he heard someone calling out to him. It was the knight in front of him, asking if he was okay, as he had called out several times already. The prince said he was fine, that it was nothing, and wanted to know what had happened. The young man explained that a merchant named Gerhard was requesting an audience. Upon hearing that name, the prince knew the entire county's debt had been incurred through the merchant known as Gerhard. The former treasurer had also said things about this man, whose character was questionable. There was also a suspicion that this merchant possessed a vault with a magical door that would only open with an orb. It didn't take long for the prince to hear the voice of the man in question introducing himself and saying he owned a small trading company. The prince replied that he'd heard that, while small, the Nilsers Corporation was quite solid. With a big smile, he said that successful merchants were always welcome. The man thanked him for the compliment politely. The prince wanted to know why a merchant of his caliber was seeking him out, since he held no official post or authority. He also mentioned that if it was a business matter, he should speak with the acting administrator, Russell. The man laughed and replied that Baron Russell was only temporarily managing the county, making it clear that, in the end, the true owner was the prince. In these lands, no one would dare challenge his decisions. The young man insisted he was only one of the two heirs and didn't need to be overestimated. The man, impressed by the prince's humility, said that even without an official declaration, the competition for succession was already over. After hearing that, the prince wanted to know where he had gotten such information. Very cheerfully, the man laughed again and apologized if he had caused any offense. He stated that, as a well-versed merchant, he wouldn't survive in that field without a solid information network. Then he grew serious as he realized the situation was different from what he had heard. They had said the prince was a naive fool detached from the world, but in truth he was cynical and clever, as if hiding his true nature. At least one fact was undeniable. He was stunningly handsome and so charming he could even make other men's hearts race. That piece of information was accurate, because he could feel his own heart pounding. However, the young man could feel the interest coming from that man. The knight beside him didn't understand why the prince suddenly stood up, overtaken by some kind of fury. With a strange aura, the prince made it clear to that man that he had no time to waste. Fixing his gaze on him, he said that if he had requested an audience, he should get straight to the point, otherwise he could leave. The man also quickly stood up, bowing and apologizing. He thought that if that meeting ended there, he'd be finished. He needed to say anything to keep that boy there. When he mentioned that the prince's beauty brought out his eyes, the protagonist found that odd. Even so, he sat back down. The man's smile truly bothered him. The merchant then revealed the reason he had requested the audience: the massive debt left by the late Count Colin. Meanwhile, the young man pretended to be uninterested, but the knight beside him looked visibly disturbed. However, when looking at the prince, it was clear he didn't care after all. He mentioned it was the first time he had heard of that debt. Picking a small scab from his nose, he commented that it was right then that the prison warden was being held. The merchant knew the young man would act like that, but it wouldn't work on him, so he stated that the debt was old. With a sinister smile, he believed the moment he had waited for with such anticipation had finally arrived. In his mind, the prince would look naive and flushed, seeking help somewhere. He was eager to witness that scene up close. He said that, according to the contract, 3 years after the loan, full repayment could be demanded. The merchant tried to contain his joy, knowing that if he showed too much excitement, he might ruin everything. With a formal tone, he apologized, but informed that by 2 weeks after the month of sacrifice of the imperial year 288, he should receive full payment, totaling 60,000 gold coins. That amount left the knight, who had only seemed annoyed before, visibly shocked. The protagonist merely glanced sideways, not understanding why the knight was acting like that. Gerhard looked at the young man, trying to stay composed, and thought it was incredibly adorable. The knight spoke on behalf of the prince, asking if it would be possible to delay the deadline a bit. The man seemed disappointed. He had wanted to hear those words from the prince's own mouth. The mood grew tense for a moment before the man said that, unfortunately, since Count Colin's passing, the county's credibility had dropped significantly. Personally, he had wanted to request the payment a year ago. While he spoke, the prince simply watched, as if he didn't care at all. The man said he believed now was the time the future count could repay that patience. The protagonist simply thought that showing up 2 weeks before the deadline wasn't exactly generous. The prince stood up and said he didn't know the county's annual revenue was 6,000 gold coins, and that 60,000 gold coins could be borrowed from anywhere, so there was no need to worry. The knight had never expected such a reaction from the prince, which left him unsettled. The man, in turn, smiled and said it was a relief. He thought the boy was the typical naive youngster. Then he said that maybe his concern had been exaggerated, although he still thought that getting 60,000 gold coins would be difficult. Smiling, he said he would return soon with the contract sealed by the county. Looking at the prince, he thought no one would ever lend such a large amount to a knave prince. He smiled, for now the contract was entirely his, asked to be excused, and said he would be leaving. And as he left, he imagined delighting himself watching that young noble beg on his knees to become a mere merchant of his. And since the prince was very handsome, He could even sell him on the slave market, or maybe even enjoy him a bit before that. Still bowing, he thanked the prince for taking the time to receive him and wished him good luck. Meanwhile, the knight was doing the math minus 60,000 gold coins, considering his weekly salary was 2 silver coins. The prince, seeing the young man doing the math, asked him to stop making absurd calculations and just sit down. The young man wanted to bring the prince back to reality, saying he should be concerned he could lose the entire territory, but the protagonist's thoughts were on the secret vault that miserable man was said to have kept in the Golda Plateau. He remembered the map and believed he already understood enough. First, he had to investigate more. Outside the city, the continent of Erin wasn't a place to go for a stroll. The Golda Plateau was a high-difficulty area, especially because it was filled with troublesome monsters like the Sasquatch. He had always avoided that area as much as possible during the game. The young man wanted to know where the prince was going, while the protagonist wondered if he knew someone who could offer good ideas about the Golda Plateau. He thought that maybe even a cautious professional might be useful. As a man looked and wondered what the prince was doing, the prince also noticed the young man heading his way. The man said it was an honor to see the prince, but he replied it was nothing special. He just needed to speak with a prisoner. The knight knew it was the same place where Guydrus had been held. The prince said it was much cozier than he had expected. The young woman said that before, everything had been decorated with expensive and flashy items, looking like something vulgar people would do. With that, the prince asked if she was enjoying the place. She was visibly satisfied. However, her attitude was seen as insolence toward the prince, and the knight felt he had to act. He was harsh with her, saying she shouldn't be insolent and unpleasant in the prince's presence. But the prince didn't seem to agree with the knight's behavior. Looking at the prince, Layla stated that he had betrayed her. At the time, he said that since she had poisoned him, she should also drink her own poison. She remembered wondering if it really was the same poison she had given him, and if so, then she was done for. In such an agonizing position, she decided to reveal facts that he could use to his advantage. After making her drink the potion, he said only he had the antidote and that it was in his head. Even so, the protagonist found her very clever for realizing it so quickly. Layla said he was there because he needed her, but she didn't know if she could help him. Putting on a pleasant face, she said she no longer intended to follow that prince's orders. But touching her own thigh and licking her lips, she said that if he could convince her, maybe she would change her mind. But he'd have to be very convincing. Each time, the knight thought she was the most insolent and obnoxious young woman. Seeing that the knight might actually hurt her, the prince asked him to stop. And looking at the young woman, he said he was there to give her a chance to survive. She asked what he meant, and he said that even if he set her free, she wouldn't last long out there. He told her that right now there was a deadly rivalry between the families, and since Layla had made Stella into a top-tier villain and even destroyed Granbini's mana core, then clearly she was the main witness to all that if she hadn't figured it out yet. Seeing her desperate reaction, he knew she hadn't considered that possibility before. Now she realized the Kosala family wanted her gone, though she had thought they wanted to clear their names and would rely on her. The prince argued that her changing her testimony wouldn't bring back Granbini's mana core. Looking at her, he spoke as sincerely as possible, saying that nobles would never let someone of inferior blood who had hindered them stay alive. He finished by saying he had seen many hunting dogs discarded by the nobles they served. The young woman's previously cheerful and confident expression began to change as she grabbed something on the table. It gave the knight the impression that she wanted to throw it at the prince. When she lunged toward him with something in hand, screaming that she would eliminate him, the prince just stared her down with a piercing gaze. But faster than her, the knight delivered a kick to her stomach, hurling her away. Calling her shameless, he asked how she dared to attack the prince. After the blow sent her to the ground, she remained there while the prince thanked the knight and asked him not to be rude to her. He asked him not to underestimate her. If he thought carefully, she had been essential to everything. Realizing how rude he had been, the knight apologized. The prince looked at the girl and said that people usually hated their own weaknesses more than the ones who drive them down. He asked her if she knew why she had confessed that, saying it was easier that way, and as he spoke, he crouched beside her. He said that unloading rage onto someone, anyone, might bring immediate relief, but added that it only lasted in the moment. He knew the girl wasn't the type to give up easily, as she had a strong survival instinct. She confirmed his words, saying she would never give up and that she would never die there. She would survive, no matter the cost. He said that was great. It was finally getting interesting. Standing up from the ground, he told her she was going to help him on a mission, and he would guarantee her safety from the hunters. And if she had family, he would ensure their protection as well. She got angry, thinking he wanted to know about her family, just to threaten them in the future and use them as hostages. That's why she told him not to dream about it. Hearing the young woman's words, the prince simply burst into laughter. He told her not to fool herself. Even if she died right there, it wouldn't make any difference to him. After all, skilled people like her were a dime a dozen, and she knew it was true. They could easily replace her, as she was nothing more than a disposable hunting dog. Even so, she questioned him. If there were so many like her, why was he chasing after her, trying to convince her? He said that if it mattered so much to her, he'd tell her his reason. It was simply to save time looking for someone else. Also because he remembered something she had told him. He said that, first of all, he raised his hand and said she had 1 minute. If she didn't accept within that time, she would finally have the freedom she claimed to want so badly. The young woman, getting ready to stand, knew she had no other choice. Just thinking for a moment made it obvious he was right. She had done the same countless times, traitor hunters until their final breath. She could even call him selfish. She didn't care. With a clenched fist, she thought the prince's pretty face annoyed her, but she had to survive. She said it was fine, that by this point, both families had passed the point of no return, and soon one of the two families would disappear. For her, it was better if it was the one that abandoned her. The prince made a wicked smile when he heard her say those words. However, she said she wanted to be treated as a mere mercenary, not as a subordinate. She wouldn't do anything outside the mission. The more the woman spoke, the more the knight grew irritated, thinking she was too arrogant. Visibly annoyed again, he asked how she dared speak like that to the prince. She had too sharp a tongue and was insolent. The young woman, seeing that she was angering the knight, raised her arms and said of course she should be respectful to the one hiring her, and with that pretty face, she said they weren't thinking of fighting their own ally, were they? Those words irritated the knight even more. He angrily asked since when they were allies. The young woman simply stared at him more closely. But the tense atmosphere was broken when the prince spoke, saying the girl had said something earlier. He concluded by saying that the shadow unit of the Kosala family trained in a field. He wanted to know if it was in the Golda Plateau, since he remembered her mentioning a field in that region. She wanted to know what the Golda Plateau had to do with it. Upon hearing that, the prince asked for a map. He wanted the knight to fetch it, a detailed map of the entire kingdom and of the area around the Kosala family's land. After all, only with a state map would he be able to see it properly. The young man said there was a very large one in the barracks meeting room, so they all headed there. The girl, seeing the enthusiasm from the two of them, thought they all had too much energy. The young man called for the prince to go. He just didn't understand why he was hanging back. The prince said it was just to check something. Then the man asked if the prince didn't know the way. The young man said he did, but preferred the knight to lead. The two stood there for a while, in a standoff about who should go first, while the young woman watched, bored. When they arrived at the barracks meeting room, he showed where the map he needed was kept. He explained it was a highly confidential military document of extreme precision. The young man immediately saw the Golda Plateau. He noticed it was right there and asked the knight to explain everything he knew. He began by saying it was a well-known area. The Kosala family and the barony of Erebon were in dispute over that territory. The reason was a high-quality copper mine, but the dispute was delaying development. The barony of Erebon was one of the county's vassals. The prince looked at the map, trying to see if it was reliable. It had been a long time since the last update. The young woman concluded that's why he wanted her help and said she could just add a few recent changes. Then the prince asked her if she could guide herself using that map. The young woman said yes, that she knew the area like the back of her hand and had played there since she was a child. And when he asked if there was anything in the Golda Plateau, the prince replied that there was only an ancient ruin he wanted to explore. The girl questioned whether he was telling the truth. She had never heard of any ruins. He asked if, when she was little, there was never a place adults forbade her to go. She thought for a moment and looked at him with those big eyes. She spent some time thinking about that question, and yes, there really had been a place she wasn't allowed to go. The prince wanted to know how long the Kosala family had maintained that secret unit. She said it was from the 6th generation. She had been in the field for 5 years, but said it all started about 15 years ago. Upon hearing that, the prince asked if the land conflict between the Kosala family and the Eredon barony began around that time. The knight replied that it was about that time, and then the girl nudged the knight and asked if he had understood anything. Annoyed, he replied no. She didn't know why there were so many questions either. Soon the two were arguing. The boy thought her attitude was insolent, and she said he was just picking on her. Meanwhile, the prince said that training an army required a huge amount of resources, meaning it was almost impossible to expand the troops. Suddenly, they didn't understand and asked what he meant. The knight commented that what the prince meant was that there had to be a large capital investment involved. The prince said that, just as the knight had said, the Kosala family had probably found a financial backer at the time. With those resources, they must have trained soldiers in secret and later use them in various covert missions. He was referring to soldiers like Layla. What they needed to find out was what those secret missions were. The girl didn't know exactly what the source of that money was or its connection to the ruins. He said that many copper and silver girls were often found together, and it was also common for copper ore to contain silver. He suspected the Kosala family had been secretly extracting silver. If that were the case, it would be a serious crime. The prince thought they should consider the possibility that they had discovered a silver mine in their territory. But gold and silver mines were, by law, property of the crown. How many nobles would honestly report such a discovery? That's why the story about the ruins was just a perfect cover to hide something. The protagonist knew it was hard for them to believe what he was saying, since he had never left the castle. Layla asked if he intended to declare war and seize their source of funds. That wasn't the right answer, since the county had no power for that, and the knight knew the prince was right. Furthermore, an undeclared mine was illegal, and even if someone took it by force, it could be reported to the crown, and then the county would gain nothing. Its territory was nearly bankrupt and in desperate need of money. Still, they wanted to know what the plan was. All the money they had accumulated illegally must be stored somewhere. The prince said that the money was illegal, and they couldn't be reported if someone deliberately took it. That extreme stance from the prince greatly pleased the knight, who thought it was the best course of action. Following the plan, that same night they gathered to set out. However, Russell asked if he was sure just that night would be enough. The Viscount knew everything had its time and place. Forcing a dangerous situation unnecessarily could cause serious problems. Still, the protagonist felt like that man was acting like a grandfather concerned for his grandson. He said that young men like that knight needed to grow up quickly so they could move forward toward their goal together. And in such an unstable situation, both of them leaving the territory at the same time would be far too risky. Russell knew the prince was right. If both left, the territory could be attacked. He apologized for his lack of foresight and wished luck to them all. Sternly, he told the prince to take care of himself, because if anything happened, he would hold him personally responsible. The young knight said he could relax, as he would personally protect the prince's life. However, that man thought it wasn't time for jokes and flicked the young man's head to sharpen his focus. Still, it was time to leave. The Viscount announced that the prince had just recovered and needed more rest. He told everyone to support the territory and decided to take the lead in that mission. He asked them to serve the prince with loyalty, and they all agreed. The protagonist, looking at those soldiers, wondered who would respect a frail lord, and strengthening the loyalty of those men was also one of his duties. Following the night, he descended into a well, holding a lantern with his mouth. He looked upward and saw that the prince was safely following him down. A short time later, they were already underground. They would continue from there to leave the castle, and the distance was long. At that point, the protagonist had already tied his hair back to move more efficiently. They continued walking along the underground path. Most of the soldiers seemed unmotivated. The knight informed the prince that they had arrived at their destination. Opening the lever to exit was very difficult. The protagonist thought that if he hadn't been paying attention, they all would have made a mistake. When the knight managed to open it, he asked the prince to hold his hand. He would help him climb up. Grabbing the knight's hand, the prince widened his eyes when he saw what was on the surface. He was surprised because it looked like they were in the basement of a residence. The knight opened the door of a boathouse and asked the prince to come out. When he got outside, he was amazed. The beauty of it all was hard to explain, yet they needed to stay prepared. Smiling, the knight asked the prince to get on the horse and pointed to the carriage. Annoyed, the protagonist asked the knight to stop calling him my lord. He asked if he was somehow trying to announce that he was the head of a hostile territory as soon as they entered the war zone. He said that from that moment on, he was to be called young master and nothing else. As the protagonist looked at the view, he thought that simply switching to merchant clothes was already strange, not to mention it was completely unnatural. Calling out to the knight, Crotto, he asked if he had arranged everything he had requested. However, the young man questioned, did he really have to wear such a stinky outfit? Smiling, the prince said he himself could wear the porter's outfit and pretend to be newly married to Layla. Trying to argue, the young man said it was fine. He would do as the prince had asked earlier. He didn't want the prince sitting next to such a wicked woman. He spoke so loudly that he drew some attention, which irritated the prince, since the man was always saying unnecessary things. The knight, in turn, was upset, as he wasn't lying. Trying to be charming, he extended his hand to Layla and called her my lady. The young woman, embarrassed, said she was fine and could keep walking. However, the young man remained in front of her with his hand extended. The protagonist just watched the scene as if witnessing a performance. That was the kind of interaction between subordinates. If they got along, they could create synergy. If not, they might form factions and start fighting one another. In the end, one side could end up in trouble or even abandon the Lord's side. The prince thought that perhaps the hero's destiny wasn't just a script, but something created by an enlightened being. Ideally, Layla proving herself to her companions would be the best outcome. He wondered if he should secretly help. He debated whether to or not. Meanwhile, the knight called out to him, saying everything was ready and they should leave, preferably before the sun rose. The knight, excited as always, showed his energetic personality. And so, that caravan carrying the prince, Layla, and other knights departed. They stopped only a few times to rest and quickly resumed their journey. As they also needed to eat, they occasionally stopped for the night to buy supplies. Thus, they traveled from village to village that day, Passing through the last rural village, the protagonist requested that everyone be informed to remove their disguises and begin preparing for real combat. The camp where they had spent the night was dismantled, as now was when the real work would begin. The prince was already dressed like a prince, and so were the knights. They were now officially a royal caravan. However, something caught the knights' attention on the way. The scouts who had been sent ahead returned, and the prince ran to hear the news. One of the men reported that there were veteran knights up ahead and a group of Bigfoots in the forest. Startled, Crotto asked how big the Bigfoot group was. A scout replied there were 5. Since the prince was smaller than the knight, he asked to be lifted up into a tree. He wanted to take a look with his own eyes. The knight looked at him kindly and said he was right. And so he lifted the young man so high that, out of fear, the protagonist clung to the knight to avoid falling. But once he was in the tree, he managed to get a clear view. He spotted something in the distance. They were massive creatures, and even from afar it was clear they were hostile. Still in the knight's arms, he now needed to come up with a plan to get past those beasts. The knight thought the best approach would be to block their retreat with fire arrows. The prince, however, didn't agree at all. He thought fire was a terrible idea. While the 2 young men argued, the girl remained at a distance, just watching. The prince thought it was madness, an adventure using untested methods. From atop the tree, the 2 of them continued that little argument. Fuming, the protagonist thought that no one on the continent knew more about monsters than he did, but there was no way to convince them. Jumping down from the tree with the prince in his arms, the knight was determined to attack the Bigfoots with fire. He said he would carry out the plan himself as he safely descended from the tree, gently holding the prince. The protagonist thought that Crotto might approve, but he wasn't sure if the others would. So the knight began to explain the plan to the Order of the Blue Lion. Everyone seemed to be watching and listening carefully to the plan. They simply accepted it. The prince thought it was madness that they hadn't even considered the risks. In the end, unless he proved his own abilities and established prestige, he would continue to be just a burden. While the knight gave the orders, the girl watched the prince and mumbled. They were all already preparing while the prince sat in a parked carriage trying to think of something. He needed to prove his abilities, but he couldn't draw too much attention. When Layla appeared, he asked if he could discuss something with her. She knew how the prince felt because she had been observing him. She also agreed that the knight's plan might fail. The expedition numbers would be nearly completely wiped out. Of course, she believed the prince would save them, even if it cost him his life. The prince said he understood everything she was saying. She wanted him to do something instead of staying silent. The young man replied that he was just trying to find a way to overcome that crisis and maintain control over his subordinates. She said she had an idea, and he was ready to hear it. She explained that Bigfoots had a strong bond with their young, and once the battle began, they would prioritize protecting them above all else. And once they hid their young, a fierce revenge drama would begin. As she spoke, he thought he already knew all of that and it wouldn't be so easy, but he asked her to share her idea anyway. The girl looked at him and thought his reaction was unexpected, but continued explaining her plan. She said their goal wasn't to eliminate the Bigfoots, but to pass through them quietly. With the prince's confirmation, she revealed she had a method. They needed to make the Bigfoots believe their hiding places weren't safe. At that moment, there were 5 groups of them blocking the path they needed to take once the night advanced. They would organize another unit to cause a distraction around the hiding spots of the females and the young. Even if temporary, all the Bigfoots would retreat to their shelters, and taking advantage of that opening, they could pass through. He asked her who would find the hideouts and attack them, since that would make the Bigfoots furious. Boldly, she said that it would be her, and the room went quiet when she did. She revealed she had planned to do that from the beginning. He wanted to know if she had a portion of the nymph herb. Startled, she asked how he had figured that out. He said it was obvious she wouldn't go on a clearly doomed mission without something to rely on. He knew that herb would trick the Bigfoots, who had a better sense of smell than dogs. The young woman was surprised. When she said he seemed like a completely different person, he began to cough, and she became concerned. Then he said that if it worked, it wouldn't be a bad thing. She told him not to worry. That place was like a playground to her. She had been sneaking around there alone since she was 8 years old. He was growing suspicious of her and wanted to know why she was straying from the right path to help them. She knew that if her family fell, she would be in danger too. The young man thought it wasn't something he could ignore, but she also didn't seem to have any reason to lie. He also told her that gaining the others' recognition wouldn't be easy and asked if she was okay with that. When she remained silent, he said it was fine. But before she left, he had one more question. Curious, she asked what it was. He pointed to a place and said that when dealing with Bigfoots, you should always assume there are at least 2 or more than the number you can see. The girl understood that those who went out to hunt always returned and attacked from behind. That's how it worked. He pointed in the directions where he thought they could be hiding, each in a different direction. Pointing toward a certain spot, he said there was a goblin colony there. It was one of their favorites. The prince was satisfied with the directions the girl had just provided. It would help a lot. The girl thought that he would definitely destroy the knights and protect those places. Trying to shift the mood, The boy said he had a few requests. While they talked, the knight kept an eye on the two, whispering to each other. They might have been plotting something. He looked toward the girl and the prince, and also saw that the girl was blushing and even smiling. But then the girl stopped laughing and started staring at him. He found it strange and asked her to wait. But the young woman didn't stop and kept getting closer to him, placing her hand on his face. When she did that, he didn't understand why, and when she began pouting, it got even worse. Blushing, he thought she was trying to take advantage of him. Afraid of what she might do, he pressed his lips together and closed his eyes. After a while, realizing nothing had happened, he opened one eye to see what was going on. Layla was still smiling and told him he had a piece of trash on him. Now he was blushing and trembling. He didn't even know if it was from nervousness or embarrassment. He was very upset because he felt like some otaku risking his life just to get an autograph from an idol. Suddenly, the knight arrived quickly and startled the prince, who, annoyed, asked what was going on. The shameless guy wanted to know what was happening between them. With his completely unfriendly glare, the prince grew even more annoyed. But suddenly he remembered that the knight could get Layla's gear ready. Crowder just looked at the prince, who said that, besides that, she would be completing a mission he had assigned her. As the young woman watched the knight, the prince continued saying he wouldn't be surprised if she vanished along the way. The knight wanted to know what kind of mission it was. Truthfully, he didn't trust her at all. However, the protagonist said it was better to just trust his judgment since they were all in the same boat. As the girl watched, it seemed like she was starting to feel a certain affinity with the prince. Even though she didn't fully understand, she'd go along with it this time, if she didn't feel right about it. The young woman said she'd go get the equipment herself. When she did, both men got very upset. Their screams after seeing her without the cloak startled a lot of people, and after removing the cloak, she was fixing her hair, which had been loose before. The two blushing young men asked what she was doing. She kept preparing without giving them the slightest attention as she adjusted every detail of her outfit. After she was ready, the young men, still red-faced, felt awkward while the other men started to notice as well. The young woman grabbed something from a small container and began rubbing it on her face. What she was applying to her face and body smelled absolutely awful, and by spreading that stench all over herself, she hoped to deceive the enemy. Holding his nose, the knight said it felt like his nostrils were going to shrink from the stench. The young woman didn't care at all whether there was a commotion around her, whether due to her extravagant clothing or the smell. She was checking whether her equipment was in good enough condition to not fail her. Seeing how prepared she was, the protagonist thought all his earlier concerns had been completely unnecessary. She then announced it was time, and they should begin the plan right away. The prince told her she could take some soldiers with her if she thought it was necessary, but she refused. She knew they wouldn't listen to her orders, so the prince left everything in her hands. Showing great agility, she immediately began jumping into the water. The prince informed his team that they would also be departing shortly. As they snuck through the forest trying to go unnoticed, the wind was blowing toward the Bigfoots, while Layla was heading against the wind in the opposite direction. He thought it was annoying and hadn't learned anything from observing. The intruder's scent soon reached the noses of the Bigfoots, who turned their heads in all directions trying to figure out where the unpleasant human smell was coming from. Meanwhile, a knight leaped toward one of the Bigfoots, trying to catch it off guard. He realized his strike had been very shallow. The prince knew that if they wanted to perform a surprise attack, they had to hit the weak spot. The guy had messed up. He should have used a thrust. Now it was time for the counterattack from that furious Bigfoot, who swung with such force that it kicked up dust everywhere. The knight thought he was done for, but managed to dodge just before getting completely crushed. The prince's eyes sparkled. He had never seen a real fight between NPCs. He found it completely different from the battles he'd seen on PC. The knight was in serious trouble now, with that raging beast right in front of him, and with just one roar, it had alerted the others. Seeing everything unfold, the protagonist thought maybe they should have attacked with fire after all. Showing bravery, the young man called for his troops to attack as well. Seeing them rushing forward, he asked the knight to be careful and wait a moment. While trying to join them, two young men stepped in front of him. They were the ones assigned to escort him, Thomas and Albu. Meanwhile, further ahead, the battle seemed to be escalating dramatically. The knight truly wasn't afraid of anything, not even those giants. Without hesitation, he launched a powerful strike in the direction of the Bigfoots. The prince looked and saw the magnitude of the attack. It lit up several kilometers around. After unleashing a supreme burst of power, the young man landed safely on the ground. His breathing was heavy, as he had spent a lot of energy on that attack. While the monster fell, the youth turned and looked at the prince with pride. However, the prince wanted him to go help the others instead of just standing there. What was easy for him was incredibly difficult for the others when facing those Bigfoots. Since the other knights didn't have the strength and vitality that Crotto had shown, all the others could do was try to run and escape in panic. One of them almost didn't make it. If his knight hadn't arrived in time, one of the others would have been in serious trouble. After saving him, he shouted for him to quickly grab his sword and fight back as fast as possible. They had neither the time nor the luxury to try eliminating them one by one. That place was becoming more dangerous by the minute, even though the knight captain acted quickly. There were many Bigfoots, and their soldiers weren't that well trained. Even though they were landing several hits, it wasn't enough to protect everyone, because those huge monsters reacted more and more with strength and brutality. Even the elders hadn't expected them to be that strong, so they always had to wait for an opening. And when one showed up, they made the most of it with fierce attacks. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. That captain showed he was fit to fight on equal terms with those monsters and created an opening. A gap appeared out of nowhere, and he felt something was wrong. When they scouted, there had only been 8 of them. Now he suspected the others were lying in ambush, waiting to catch them off guard. The knight noticed that the one missing was heading straight for the prince. Desperately, he screamed for the other knights to get that monster as fast as possible before it attacked the prince. The knights guarding the prince asked him to retreat before the monster took them all down. From a distance, the knight captain had to do something, so he launched a powerful enough strike. Meanwhile, the prince was behind those protecting the young man up front and had to block the power before it hit. Once the light faded and the dust settled, the prince asked if they had managed to eliminate them, but they saw a huge hand reaching toward one of the knights to grab him. Unfortunately, that knight had no way to escape. He was seized and dragged away by the beast, while the protagonist stood with wide eyes, shocked by the earlier power and now by the monster's attack. He was terrified. There was still one knight left to save him, but the monster was coming back. It slammed its hand into the ground to show them its strength. Their captain was far from pleased. Gripping his giant sword, he was about to charge at the beast again. Leaping toward it, he was already preparing for another attack. The knight who had been guarding the prince watched everything, unable to do anything, hoping it wouldn't get worse. The prince called the remaining knight and told him to go fight as well. If things continued that way, they would all be wiped out. However, the knight said he couldn't hold on much longer. Curious, the prince asked if someone would arrive to save them if he held the line. He took the young man's hand and told him to think carefully. If the soldiers fell, he would have to face both monsters alone, and if that happened, he'd be in even greater danger. Then the prince shouted, asking if Thomas was really willing to defy the orders of his own lord. He bowed and said that he was also a knight and believed his duty was to follow the command of his lord. Still, he said that from that point on, he would obey. The protagonist, seeing that his orders would finally be followed, felt a bit relieved. Continuing forward, the prince thought he had found the place, when from afar he spotted something. He shouted that he had found it. On the ground, near where the prince was looking, he spotted the soldier who had been guarding him. Approaching the knight, the protagonist shouted for Albu not to give up and to stay awake. He said that to give him first aid, he'd need to remove the armor, and then gave him a liquid. Being very careful with the knight, the prince was doing everything in his power. He noticed swelling in the abdominal area and suspected the sand might be hiding a serious internal hemorrhage. That's why he was deeply upset. He only had one low-grade potion and knew it wouldn't be enough. They needed to find a healing mage as quickly as possible, or else use at least a mid-grade potion. He begged the knight Albu to hang on and stay alive, as he would leave but return as soon as possible. Through the corner of his eye, the knight saw everything the prince did and also noticed he was moving away. When the prince returned, he was surprised by the appearance of Bigfoots accompanied by some goblins. Just as Layla had said, that was the goblin camp, the Bigfoots' hunting ground. Besides hunting them for food, they were extremely noisy. The prince felt his stomach churn at the sight of a Bigfoot eating a goblin, to the point he had to cover his eyes. Trembling with clenched fists, he felt he might not be able to endure it. He was afraid. The plan was perfect, and Layla should have set the trap so he could escape unharmed. But this wasn't a world where he could simply sit in front of a monitor and type on a keyboard. He felt his heart pounding, and when he closed his eyes, he remembered that Knight Albu needed him. So he began saying things to himself in an attempt to calm down. He was sure he could do it. With a careful but very clumsy step, he stepped out from behind the tree, gripping his sword, and caught the Bigfoot's attention. He told the enormous beast that today would be the day it perished at the hands of a prince. As he said that, the Bigfoot got distracted, and someone pulled a rope, triggering the trap. With that, several wooden arrows with slightly sharpened tips pierced the thick skin of the Bigfoot. The creature felt a sting and let out a roar, not just of pain, but also to alert the others. Now the prince stood atop the fallen Bigfoot, which enraged its partner who had watched it all unfold. Charging quickly at the prince, the giant monster struck the ground, but the protagonist managed to dodge just in time. Suddenly, he pulled another rope, releasing new traps to contain the ferocious monster. In the distance, screams could be heard. It was an Arachin web, and if he slipped up, the Triton potion at the tips of the spikes could be fatal. For most monsters, this substance could be used to capture them without much trouble, and Layla used it to mask her body odor. However, the Triton potion had a powerful anesthetic effect, which caused the Bigfoot to become paralyzed. Even immobilized, the protagonist felt he had to finish it. He grabbed his sword, raised his arms, and let out a fierce cry. He plunged the sword into the skull of that massive beast. The tip struck the bone. That sensation wasn't something he could feel while playing on the PC with just keyboard and mouse. However, even though the feeling was intense, it was also disgusting. He never thought he'd engage in such a horrid act. There he was, taking the life of a living creature with his own hands. It was lamentable and at the same time, a despicable act, considering he had fought evenly with a Class 4 knight. For his level, he was surprisingly weak, but now the prince had no time to waste. He knew he was in goblin territory. Being there, he had to be as cautious as possible, for goblins were treacherous beings, and with one careless moment, in a fraction of a second, one of the goblins launched itself at the prince, who widened his eyes. Realizing he hadn't been struck, he noticed someone had thrown themselves in front of him. With their own life, they had saved the protagonist. However, the prince was now lying on the ground with only a few scrapes. He looked back and saw that the cursed goblin was still standing after fatally wounding someone. The prince looked down and saw Albu. Somehow, he had reached him and sacrificed his life to protect him. Seeing his loyal knight lying on the ground, rage filled Prince Calix's heart, and he immediately charged at the goblin. He was going to strike him and wanted to take his life at all costs. He lunged forward with a furious blow. The goblin had no time to react. The prince's hatred and all his pent-up rage were being unleashed in the form of savage blows against the creature. However, the goblin managed to dodge, as his short arms helped him avoid deeper cuts. The prince stepped back slightly and realized his body was too weak. He could barely swing the sword with precision. However, he had greater reach thanks to his long arms. If he combined the sword's length with the reach of his arms, he could create more space between himself and his enemies, making his strikes more accurate. Knowing this, he realized he had a chance to win. When the goblin leaped into the air to attack him, he gripped his sword tightly and swung it in a frontal strike. As he was still a beginner in real combat, he only managed to hit the goblin's ear, leaving an opening for a counterattack. In the next moment, both fell to opposite sides. Although he thought he'd be hit in the shoulder, he narrowly dodged it. The simple fact that he was still alive was enough incentive to try again. So he gathered his strength and charged at the goblin once more, determined to subdue it. With a precise kick to the enemy's hand, he knocked the creature's dagger away, disarming it. Now he had the chance to finish it. The hatred was visible in his eyes, and the goblin had no way to defend itself anymore. This time, the prince landed a solid blow to the monster's stomach. Despite his victory, he was extremely exhausted, yet the sight of the goblin pinned to the tree brought him strange relief. Looking at his hands, he felt a wave of nausea. The strong smell of blood made him want to vomit. It definitely wasn't anything like the game he was used to. His life was truly in danger. Still, a status window appeared before him. Exhausted, he tried to read what it said. The message congratulated him for defeating a monster and praised him for using poison and traps. It also stated he had received bonus rewards for eliminating a Class D and a Class F monster. He had won his first battle, and with that, his rewards had increased. His level, previously 8, had now risen to 11. Still staring at the status window, unable to believe he had unlocked the inventory, he was startled by a voice. It was the knight Crotto, asking if he was safe. The young captain was tired, sweaty, and could hardly believe the prince's accomplishments. He had taken down a Bigfoot and a goblin all by himself. Because of this, Crotto decided to examine the prince to check if he was injured. The prince, in turn, asked how he had done. The captain said that unfortunately, after eliminating 2 of the monsters, the rest had retreated. Upon hearing that, the prince thought it was pure luck, but he knew that wasn't the case. Layla's plan had been a success. He then told the captain about the fallen knight and asked for help to find him. Crotto pointed to a location, saying the knight was around there. But when the prince looked, his eyes were filled with agony. Of course, the protagonist wasn't naive enough to think that in war, everyone would walk away unscathed. But he never imagined he would have to apologize to someone who was no longer alive. He apologized to the soldier, believing that if he hadn't been so careless, the man might still have had a chance. The other soldiers, including the captain, could feel the genuine sadness the prince was experiencing. Very sorrowful, Crotto told the protagonist it wasn't his fault, but that the man had died an honorable death. Everyone had to deal with a distraught prince who was shouting at them all, telling him to stop being ridiculous. Angrily, he said that there was no such thing as an honorable death. Death was death, and that was it. The knight captain fell silent. He figured it was the first time the prince had lost a subordinate, so it was understandable. He remained there, in that state of pain and mourning, for a long time, until the others had to tend to the victims and begin evacuating them. That's when the prince asked what the situation was on their side. The captain replied that they had 3 dead and 1 injured, and added that given the circumstances, the damage was light. That prince was almost speechless. He believed the failure was his own. He thought to himself that if he had used his knowledge in the planning, no one would have died. He himself had only survived because of the traps Layla had set up. also because Albu gave his life to protect him. Just thinking about that hurt. He clenched his fists and screamed as loudly as he could. Seeing him that way moved the hearts of the knights, who saw he was truly feeling the loss. Amidst tears and screams, the prince asked what they should do with the bodies of those who had fallen in battle. The young captain said that, if the situation wasn't too critical, they would recover the bodies. The prince said he understood and ordered them to do so. After receiving the order, the captain relayed it to his soldiers, and when he turned to them, he was shocked. The brave knights were trembling and in tears. They thought the prince was too kind. Now they all had a real desire to protect Prince Calyx at any cost. The captain saw that the expressions on all of his knights had changed, and when he looked back and saw the prince, he knew that he had succeeded in winning the hearts of all the knights. However, the prince was already far away in the carriage, tending to the knights who hadn't survived. Later, the captain approached him and informed him that all the bodies had been treated with preservation potions. The preparations were complete, and everyone would move out at his signal. When he turned and saw all the knights, the prince noticed that even the way they looked at him had changed. He knew it was time to stop feeling guilty. He had to give the soldiers hope for the future. He said that everyone had been successful in the battle against the Sasquatch and would now march toward their destiny. He told those who were healthy not to neglect caring for the wounded and to never abandon their comrades. Then he asked if everyone understood. Everyone stood at attention and shouted, "Yes, my lord." However, an hour earlier, Layla had been passing through that area. She had nearly been devoured by a Bigfoot herself, and had to rely on luck not to perish. Still, she was agile and skilled, a mercenary trained for stealth attacks. She managed to escape from that Bigfoot with relative ease, despite his desperate attempts to eliminate her. The young woman continued her near-acrobatic movements, thinking she needed to be as fast as possible. With that in mind, she set up each trap, thinking of the well-being of the prince and the other knights. When attacked and harassed by that Bigfoot, at a certain point she had to eliminate him, since he had taken the bait. With one of them restrained, she now needed to act and prepare the other traps. However, that Bigfoot was resilient and still had strength and vitality in his body. He tore up 2 trees, leaving Layla in terrifying danger. That creature was about to grab and crush her with his hands. She had to step back a few paces and then attack, just as she had been highly trained to do. When her eyes passed over the ferocious beast, she already knew what her next move would be. While he roared in anger and fury, she slipped a cord around his neck. This time, she tightened it with full force to truly restrain him. He screamed furiously as she fled. With a quick glance back, she saw that, in a way, the cord had worked. It had stretched, using the monster's own tendons against him. The cord was thin enough that he couldn't grab it with his massive fingers, leaving him thrashing around uselessly. However, Layla saw that his strength was immense, enough to bring down an entire tree. Being cautious, she quickly grabbed the Triton potion. She needed to inject it directly into the monster's bloodstream. To do so, she had to move quickly, and in a nearly careless moment, he placed his hands over her head, almost hitting her. Though she was winning, she was still dealing with a creature 1,000 times bigger and far stronger. She had to strike precisely and inject the potion into a vein of that huge monster. This time, she was accurate and managed to drive the syringe into the monster's back. Now she could only hope it would work. There was no other option. The monstrous creature, enraged, tried to break free from the cords, knocking down everything around him. When Layla saw him bring down a tree, a chill ran through her body. But just a few moments later, the creature collapsed to the ground, seemingly unconscious. She was surprised to see that the potion had actually worked. She could hardly believe it. Even if she didn't want to admit it, when it came to poisons, the prince was one step ahead of her. Still, it was strange how a person could change so drastically overnight, just like the protagonist had. She had been watching that man closely for over a year, but suddenly he seemed completely different. Maybe it was for the better. She thought she would never be able to achieve her revenge. But now, looking at the clear sky between the trees, she felt like maybe she could. Elsewhere, the prince watched his soldiers. Some were injured, others exhausted. Those in better condition helped carry the ones who could barely stand. The prince asked the captain if they should rest for a while somewhere. Seeing that the prince himself also needed rest, he immediately agreed. All the knights were visibly tired and still mourning the loss of their comrades. That's when the prince brought out some potions and asked them to drink, as they would help with recovery. The knights could hardly believe a prince was offering them elixirs. Still, they gratefully accepted. The prince felt satisfied just seeing his men recovering. The captain, puzzled, asked what the prince was doing. He only muttered, "Here comes the dramatic one." Annoyed, the captain said that although they were low-grade potions, they were very expensive. He also said that Viscount Russell had prepared them especially for the prince, and that supply represented half the stock of the count's house. Irritated, the protagonist asked the captain if he wanted him to just stand there and do nothing. He wouldn't simply turn his back and ignore the suffering of his men. The knight noticed the prince was angry and tried to make amends. Regardless of what was said, the prince handed out potions to all the soldiers who needed them. As he approached one knight, he patted him on the shoulder and told him not to worry. After that expedition, he could drink as many low-grade potions as he wanted. The knight called the prince's attention. All the others seemed to be doing better and were bowing to him. He knew that a man gives his life for someone who recognizes his worth. He was certain that everyone now felt they had finally found the leader they truly wished to follow. The captain shouted that the time was near, and the prince looked at the knights, shivering at the determined gazes he received. After all the commotion, he sat in a corner to be alone and finally checked his evolution rate. The status screen showed that he had managed to raise his support from 14% to 18%. That news brought a faint smile to the prince, who had just gone through intense moments. After everything, they were once again following the trail that would lead them to the ruins. This time, the prince was even more alert to every movement around him, and so they were moving along that path when suddenly, the protagonist asked them to stop. The knight wanted to know why they were stopping, and the prince announced that they had reached their destination. However, the captain was startled as he didn't see anything, not even the supposed secret vault. He also noticed there were no guards around and wondered if the vault had been abandoned. The question was whether they had contacted Layla, and the captain replied that they hadn't yet. They decided to set up camp there. The captain thought it strange, but didn't want to question the prince's order, who said the tent should be placed exactly where they were. And so it was done. A large tent was erected, and the prince suspected that the Kosala family's secret vault was located there. Showing the map to his subordinates, he wanted everyone to understand his reasoning. The captain questioned the prince. If the destination were just a bit farther, it would take a week to reach. He explained that, up until that point, the soldiers had endured that inhuman march purely through willpower. He added that if he told them they'd need to march for another week, more than half would give up. At that, both fell silent for a while, until one of the soldiers warned that if they stayed there too long, the enemy could find them. Furthermore, they'd notice something suspicious and feel threatened. Hearing all that, the protagonist thought they were all whining and told them to pay attention. Then he said that he had only pointed out the location of the secret vault and had never said they would go all the way there. The captain was even more terrified, as he had assumed the purpose of the mission was to steal the vault. The prince then stated that they would enter the secret vault through an entrance located right there, and he pointed to a spot on the ground. He stomped his foot a few times to indicate where he meant. When he stomped several times, one stone shifted from the others and a column rose. This left the captain and other soldiers terrified. Afterward, trying to act natural, they watched the protagonist insert some kind of password, which made the vault shift slightly. Once the dust settled, they noticed something was happening. An underground passage had opened. The soldiers and the captain were extremely startled. They had never imagined the prince knew such details. When the prince tried to enter, they attempted to stop him, saying it was dangerous and that they would take it from there. Annoyed, the prince said they could do as they please, though he doubted anything would happen. The captain then asked how he knew so much about that dungeon and wanted to understand where he had gotten that information. Smiling, the protagonist said it was from a reliable source, and considering that until now they had only shown weakness and incompetence, they should ask themselves why it was so hard to believe in him. The soldier was saddened. It wasn't what he meant. When they smiled and said they believed in the prince, they showed that they knew he genuinely valued even the lowest-ranking soldiers. That's why they trusted him, and everyone supported that soldier. They all stated that, if the cause was just, dying on the front lines would be a duty and the greatest of honors. The prince lowered his head in sadness, saying he was still the same weak person who couldn't use mana. The soldier said that strength wasn't merely physical, and that true power came from within, as chivalry taught. The prince was left speechless by the soldier's praise. Looking to the side, he saw that his captain was in tears, deeply proud of his troop. The protagonist knew that outside, there were people walking the line between life and death, some gravely wounded. The prince told everyone to hurry, and one by one, they entered that passage. Looking up, the prince wished that Layla was safe. Meanwhile, the girl seemed fine and was collecting some Bigfoot extract. As she watched the enormous monster wiping its mouth, she figured it must take a lot of energy. Upon finding a cave, she headed toward it. It was time to have some fun with fire. Already inside the cave, she began striking one stone against another to produce fire. Jumping from tree to tree, she thought all the Bigfoots in the area should gather at that spot. Looking back, she realized the real problem was right there. That's when she saw the enemy army. In a way, she knew those soldiers would appear sooner or later. She wanted to know what happens when someone turns their back on a person who has ascended to the position of executor. She would show them what it was like to be that careless. Now that enemy patrol was scouring the territory where the battle against the Bigfoots had taken place, they seemed to be taking notes on everything that happened for a possible report. They noticed that after the battle, the soldiers had managed to repel the Sasquatchs, and they knew there was only one house nearby capable of driving away such monsters. They needed to report to the Viscount in charge immediately. However, Layla was already infiltrated in the enemy army and noticed they were sealing the hunting bags. She knew that was the method scouts used to seal their reports. touching her hand to her mouth and then pointing her finger somewhere. She noted the direction of the wind. She would need to be fast if she wanted to succeed, so she threw the liquid from the vial onto a tree. While someone was finishing sealing the report, Layla was approaching from that direction. After masking her own scent, she also set fire to the area where the Sasquatch had been. The fire, the creature's screams, and the smell in the air awakened something even greater. Someone was looking for the group of scouts and knew that if they had been wiped out, it had to be serious. They needed to report it. He climbed a tree to get a better look at what was happening. He didn't know if he had evaded the danger, when suddenly he felt a sharp blade pierce through his chest. With no chance to retaliate, he could only look at the sharp object embedded in his chest, wondering who had done it. He didn't have time to see or hear when Layla attacked. His body fell from the top of the tree, and Layla descended after him to investigate. She needed to know who he was. She had to inform the prince quickly, so she would leave the bodies for the monsters to deal with. Meanwhile, the prince wondered if it had all just been a coincidence, or if someone had passed information to the enemy. One of the knights said they had managed to get their hands on a magical crystal ball. With wide eyes, the prince thought that situation couldn't be ordinary. Even if the energy there had weakened over time, it wasn't something that a mere Viscount's mage could break. The prince wanted to know who Viscount Servio's lord was, and he was told it was Marcus Antonio. They also found precious stones and crystals commonly used as material for magical experiments. There were also some enchanted artifacts, like accessories with supportive magic, but none particularly valuable. The prince thought there had to be some important artifact in a place exposed in a display case. That's when he spotted 2 columns and suspected there was something significant there. The captain arrived and said the investigation was complete, but they still didn't know what dangers might be lurking. Frustrated at being unable to act at that moment, the prince simply turned his back on the knight's captain. Both examined the wall, certain that somewhere in that place there had to be a switch to a secret door. That's when he found it. As soon as he activated it, a door opened, magically lit. The knight, absolutely astonished, stood in awe with the prince at the discovery. He had thoroughly investigated the ruin's foundation and had never seen a room like that. The prince explained that what he was looking at was just a false ruin. He said they had built fake facilities around it to fool intruders like thieves. The captain understood that the prince was saying that the secret chamber belonged to the family of Viscount Koshatin. Then the knight wanted to confirm, was his prince saying they could take the hidden treasures without even entering the secret chamber? The protagonist thought he had seen this on the game screen, but to open the door to that place, he had to strongly visualize the function he desired in his mind. The captain believed he was manipulating complex artifacts with great skill and thought he had talent for magic. Suddenly, Crotto heard a noise and asked what that sound was. Meanwhile, the prince called him over as well, because a new door had opened. He told him it was a door that led to the false ruins. All that was left was to go there and retrieve Gerard's silver. He explained that by operating the control device, he could view several locations and identify which ruin Gerard was using. The young man thought that was a door he had seen before. The prince agreed that it was the entrance to the silver ruin. The captain was shocked, as he had just discovered how they were mining silver without the royal family's knowledge. It was explained to the captain that no one was at the site, and it seemed they only mined during specific times. However, the captain believed that if the miners had returned safely, rumors would have already spread. Seeing how complicated the situation was, the prince wanted to make sure it never happened again. To do that, he would need to deactivate the crystal ball key that the enemy had. That way, he could change the code. So he would destroy the stone gate and prevent them from entering. That would be his farewell gift. He asked the captain to move all the silver-filled crates so the expedition numbers could take them. They were also to place the scroll they had prepared. Once they finished, noticing the captain was uneasy, he asked what was wrong. Realizing it was just concern, the prince made it clear that he could finish everything alone. After seeing the captain had already left, the prince stretched his arms and was satisfied to be alone. If he remembered correctly, the switch should be somewhere around there. However, the door opened. He recognized it from the game, but seeing it in real life was different. That was the Tristan bracelet of revelation. If he suffered fatal wounds, it would protect him with a barrier. It showed that the bracelet would grant up to a week if the person wasn't treated, and it could be activated 3 times. He looked at the artifact proudly. It was perfect for someone like him, who had low combat power. He quickly put it on his wrist. It was like having 3 lives, he thought. Now it was time to move. He didn't even feel anything, but his spine suddenly shivered. He looked inside the cavity and saw glowing black inscriptions. It was the first time he had seen that language, but he could understand a little. He had seen that name before. Hecatoria was the goddess who taught humans the magic system. For a moment, he wondered if it had something to do with his presence in that world. When he placed his hands over the inscription, he felt something strange. He couldn't see anything anymore and didn't know where he was. A flash of light and something like an eye appeared in front of him. He thought it was something divine. If that was the case, then it must be God's. He kept staring at that blue eye as if the world were inside it. An aggressive voice told him no, and as the refusal echoed, he began to feel intense pain. He didn't know what was happening. It was as if words were being dumped straight into his mind. It was wrong, far too inhuman. It seemed like a red-haired woman was the one speaking. The voices asked if there was a human present. It sounded like several people were talking. As much as Hekatoria tried to stop it, she couldn't. It had already been decided by vote. When asked if she was thinking of breaking the pact, she replied that this was violence, and that she would never agree with it. They all said it was a pity. If she wanted so badly to be human, then she would be. With that, the eyes seemed to open beneath the red-haired woman, who also began to feel intense pain. It was a horrifying, chilling song, or maybe it was just how he was perceiving something. The protagonist couldn't hear actual sounds, but it was terrible. When he tried to open his eyes, he could see something among the brightness. It looked like there was a woman in the middle of all that light, screaming. Her screams were hurting the protagonist's hearing, and he tried to block them with his hands. As the woman in the center of the circle suffered excruciating pain, her hair began to change color slightly. The voices called her Hekatoria, but they said she had fallen to the level of a demigoddess and could no longer be called that. From now on, she would become an object of hatred and contempt, even from the human she had loved so much. It seemed that those words were being engraved into the protagonist's mind as he listened to them insult that woman. They said they could hardly wait to see the look on her face in that moment. That's when the young man's eyes suddenly opened. As if nothing had happened, he was back where he had been before, like he had never left. But he also noticed that a status window was opening. It was so frightening that he screamed. He had acquired an authority-level skill, an extremely powerful ability, but limited to close range. He knew that skills were usually ranked from the lowest, F, up to rank S. But when he looked at the authority skill, he realized it was different. It was a power that only those ranked as class 10 or higher, known as demigods, could use. While checking the status screen, he noticed something else. A fragment of authority had been absorbed, increasing the rank of his soul. There was no doubt about it. The one who sent him to that world was the goddess Hekatoria. To harm a god, only an authority-level skill would be enough. He thought he should take revenge on the other gods in Hekatoria's name. At first, that scared him. Then, a slight smile appeared on his face, and he began to laugh. That was the final objective of the game. He didn't like feeling manipulated, but he wanted to be all of it, no matter what happened. While thinking and talking to himself, someone called out to him. It was the captain of the knights. The captain asked the prince not to be surprised by what he was about to say, leaving him intrigued. However, upon seeing what it was about, the prince was ecstatic. There was so much that time wasn't enough to evaluate it all. There were 6 crates full of gold coins, and he estimated there were about 30,000 coins in total. The prince said it was roughly what he expected. However, there were still 420 crates packed with silver bars. It was estimated that roughly their value equaled 100,000 gold coins. The problem now was how to transport all of it. With only the expedition force, it wouldn't be easy. The young man thought he had heard that the current problem was having too much gold. But to him, the amount didn't matter. That was not a problem. He had won his first battle and unlocked his inventory. It would be very useful in that situation. He decided to test it with those crates first, and upon doing so, the captain was shocked. Winking at the knight, the prince said it was fine, just bring more crates to him. When everything was ready, he asked them to prepare for the journey back. Meanwhile, the captain was wondering what the prince would do with all those stacked crates. In that world, there was no concept of players or skills, and no one there would understand what an inventory was. There was no need to explain everything. He just needed to hide it. The captain asked what he would do with the mountain of crates, considering everyone was already outside. The young man replied that it was all fine. He had obtained a super special bracelet, and it should have enough space for all the crates. The captain could hardly believe he possessed such an artifact. The young man said it was a secret, and he couldn't tell anyone. The captain said he would keep watch outside while he handled the transfer. He knew he needed to focus on the object he wanted to teleport. A status window appeared. He had to think of the inventory in that state. Just like in the game, he could store artifacts in his inventory. So he started putting in the gold bars one by one. He did the same with the silver ones, until it was all done. It was a lot of work, but it was finished. With the job completed, it was time to go back. As he climbed the steps, he was welcomed back. The knights were ready to depart for their own territory. Someone called out to him. He turned to see who it was. The problem was that Layla still hadn't returned. The captain feared she had betrayed them and fled, saying he never trusted her. But the prince thought differently. He knew she was organizing everything. He said it was no coincidence that the Big Feet had retreated. Those words surprised everyone, as no one had any idea that Layla had been helping them all along. As soon as he finished saying those things about Layla, all the knights looked at him with wide eyes without saying a word. Shortly after, the captain was extremely alarmed, saying that attacking the Big Feet's hideout alone was nothing short of suicide. From the beginning, he never had a good impression of that girl, but he didn't want her to perish like that. The prince said he wanted to use another method. but the captain dismissed it. Hearing that, the captain lowered his head, because when the prince spoke, he thought it was dangerous. But he was wrong. He thought that since the girl hadn't returned, something might have happened to her. He said that thanks to Layla, they avoided many sacrifices. Now it was their turn to repay the help. With that, he asked the knights if he was right. Many didn't know what to say. That was when Captain Indra came and said they would do as the prince commanded. Upon hearing that scream, he thought it was unnecessary, but all the other soldiers screamed too. He felt like he had done nothing on that expedition but get in everyone's way, and he thought that at least as a knight he could fulfill his duty. That's when the prince asked him to select the members who would be part of the separate squad. The rest were to wait safely in the basement. He believed there were two possibilities regarding what had happened to Layla, that she was in trouble. He suspected the Bigfoots had found her, since the pursuers didn't know they were there. Besides, Layla had said she had erased all tracks. He didn't think she would be careless enough to get caught. The question was how they suddenly found Layla, when suddenly his eyes lit up as if he had an idea. The captain, noticing, asked what he was going to do. He then called everyone to gather. They would go straight to the Bigfoot chief. He would get revenge on him. He asked the captain to boil some herbs in oil and coat their weapons with it. He told them to just do what he asked and stop complaining. Looking up, the prince asked Layla to wait for them. Observing a den, he thought there would be only females and their young inside. They assumed the males were busy chasing Layla or hunting for food. The orders were to start dealing with those inside the den. That way, they would attract the attention of the males. However, the captain was worried, because dealing with those monsters wouldn't be easy. With a smile, the prince said they'd see for themselves how powerful that poison was. The same one they had soaked their swords in. After doing what the prince commanded, they managed to draw attention. Now they had to go all in and storm that den and do what needed to be done. The prince warned that the big ones were coming and they needed to hide. All that was left was to track them. Alarmed by the noise and sensing intruders, the males charged into the den. Now that everyone was inside, they had to run as fast as they could. And thanks to Layla, they now had clear footprints to follow. With the prince on his back, the captain was running, because the prince believed there was no way Layla would lose. With the captain on his back, he was running, following those large footprints. As he ran, the prince was asked if he liked Layla. Smiling, the captain said she was quite beautiful. The prince said it wasn't like that at all and told him to focus on the chase. Even so, Crotto never thought Layla would volunteer for such a dangerous mission. The fact was that she realized they would need her, and even though she was well known in that place, she still went. There she was like a celebrity. Maybe it was because of the urgency to survive. The first continental event in that game was the kingdom's invasion and the faction that would play a major role during that time. At first she thought they were just volunteer soldiers, but maybe it was a faction with a noble, Viscount Sarvio. He might have been intentionally cultivating them within the cave. They were all happy because they had won. Everyone excitedly said it was just as the prince had said. They wouldn't suffer a single injury. However, the captain warned there was no time to rest. They were going to find the prince. Everyone agreed and departed immediately. The captain thought he respected the prince from the bottom of his heart. He wanted him to always be safe. However, a dark aura and someone lying on the ground, badly wounded. As the knight carried the prince on his back, they saw Layla from afar. The protagonist immediately shouted for him to stop. He had spotted Layla in danger. The two went straight to deal with the wolves that were trying to devour Layla. The knight shouted that he would scatter the wolves. While the prince got close to Layla, he asked her to pull herself together. He noticed the wounds were deeper than he expected. The fear was that she wouldn't recover, not even with a mid-grade potion. Even so, he applied the potion to the wound. Thank the heavens, she was alive. The wound would heal gradually. She needed to drink the potion for the recovery to begin. Returning, the knight said he had managed to drive the beasts away. With that, the prince asked for help to turn Layla over, because he had to make her drink the potion quickly. With that, they noticed the girl's color was returning to normal. She seemed much better. That's when the captain and the rest of the group arrived. The prince was relieved because it was just in time. A week after the incident in the count's castle, the prince was sweating. He had decided to start working out. His current level was 18. While the average combat level of a healthy adult man was around 20. Russell noticed that despite the short training period, the prince's endurance was increasing. They could tell he seemed to have been gifted with a strong physique. The captain believed it was true that he had changed, and he even suspected the prince might be secretly taking something, which earned him some flicks to the head from Russell. The protagonist's journey to level up was just beginning. Because of that, the captain asked when they would continue sword training. Russell told him not to worry. Sweaty, the young prince seemed to be finished, as he had business to attend to at the magic tower. Those words impressed the captain. To clarify, the prince said he was going to take a bath, so they should prepare for the visit to the tower branch. Russell noticed that the captain deeply trusted the young lord. The captain admitted he didn't understand many things about him, but still, one thing was certain. He was exceptionally talented. Someone like the captain couldn't even imagine all of his skills. He added something else. The prince genuinely cared about his subordinates and the people under his rule. Russell said that at first he was only there to look after him, but later he had trouble keeping up with his thoughts and actions. The captain stated that even so, he would still need a master to guide him, and the Viscount's authority was extreme. The prince replied that it couldn't be helped. He was only 15 and didn't yet have an official title. After Count Colin passed away, they were worried that dark clouds would loom over the territory. While the prince was bathing, they talked about how they never thought someone so suitable would appear. However, everyone knew that the son of the lion was also a lion. Jana, branch of the magic tower in the territory of Shiken. The prince and his knight were warmly welcomed by a young woman with light hair, glasses, and an apparently polite demeanor. She was very excited to see the two, saying that there was a cute boy and a handsome muscular man. She said she didn't know who they were, but handsome men were always welcome, and she asked them to take a seat. The protagonist thought such a direct response was unexpected from a mage. She quickly asked if they would like some tea, manipulating magic on the kettle and teacups, forcing the objects to serve the two guests. As she finished serving the gentleman, the prince took off his cloak and began observing the young woman. She seemed careful with her porcelain. He noticed she was holding the kettle and heating the tea. She was doing it with her bare hands. He guessed she was a Class 5 mage, but being at a branch had clearly worn her out. He looked at her status window and saw her name, age, and rank. He thought it was surprising, and she wanted to know what surprised him so much. The protagonist said that, honestly, he hadn't expected someone like her to be in such a rural area. Watching quietly, the captain thought that maybe that young woman was the lord's type. The woman replied that the prince was charming. He told her that judging by her skills, she should be Class 5. Winking at her, he said it was nearly impossible for someone to reach that level before the age of 20, unless she was a disciple of the tower's master. Upon hearing that, the captain made a strange face, since the girl looked a bit older. Seeing that the captain was about to ruin everything, the prince pinched his butt. Feeling all flattered, the girl said that she might look young, but being mistaken for the master's disciple was a huge compliment. When she said she was over 30, the prince smiled and asked her what was the secret to such youthfulness. While listening, the captain rubbed his butt after being pinched, sipping his tea in frustration. After a pleasant chat and some tea, the girl decided to ask what they were doing there that day. That startled the captain, as the girl had gotten straight to the point all of a sudden. The prince was also direct. He said he was there to buy an explosion scroll. That made the young mage super excited. She thought he was a valuable customer. She said that 30 scrolls cost 600 gold coins, but with a special discount for a gifted young man, she'd do it for 500 and asked what he thought. He figured that just having a pretty face already made it worth it, and said it was fine as is. The young woman told him not to worry. Even though the magic tower was in terrible shape, the authority of branch director was still the same. The prince said he had one more request, and the girl told him to feel free. He started by saying it was a bit difficult to talk about, but he wanted to request a loan from the reserve bank. Upon hearing that, she was horrified and asked how much he needed. When she heard it was 60,000 gold, she nearly choked on her tea. She said she couldn't just use the money however she wanted. The young man said he understood. He told her that, in return, he would leave gold and silver coins with her as collateral. Of course, he was already borrowing it. He said he would also pay interest, and that it would be for a short period. Still, it was a good deal. While she didn't answer, he was already sweating intense, because he had no other place to get the money. The young woman, with her head lowered, apologized, but it seemed a bit excessive. The prince thought his favorability wasn't enough. He felt he had been too hasty. The young woman said she thought the supervisor would completely refuse. However, there was one way. As he could see, central supervision hadn't come that day, so she would keep it a secret between the three of them. Of course, the prince thought it was a great idea. She said that as long as he paid within 6 months, there'd be no problem. However, if 6 months passed, she would sell all the gold and silver she was keeping as collateral. He thought that was exactly what he wanted them to do. He thought that mages always needed resources for research. He reflected on that while she talked about the tea. Both of them lowered their heads and said it would be a great relief if they could make it work. As he bowed his head, the prince thought that in this way, the debt Gerard owed him would be settled. Elsewhere, someone was yelling that they needed the map. It was Gerard, furious. One of the patrols that had been pressing the vault had disappeared and vanished from the map. He believed the location of the clues found by the patrol vanished at that very spot. Looking at the map, he saw that walking along the mountain trail to the secret vault entrance would take more than a day. Since the direct route could be done in a day, his eyes widened and fists clenched. He believed something had happened. He shouted for his subordinates to go to the Gold Highlands immediately and prepare. In the Highlands, they saw a golem and wondered how they were going to defeat that thing. Gerard told them all to stay calm. It was just a stone golem. It was big, but its movements were slow. His vassals went ahead to try to eliminate the massive creature. The golem was slow, and they should have been able to dodge it easily. However, some of them failed to dodge in time, and since a member of the knight class was defeated, it caused agony and fear in the others. The golem was going after every one of them. Someone among them asked everyone to hold their ground and attack together. But that same person was trampled and thrown aside. When they realized another knight class member had fallen, fear spread. The golem was extremely dangerous and was eliminating everyone who got close. Gerard stood still, watching for a moment, while his vassals couldn't believe a golem had appeared. He had heard that golems don't form naturally. There had to be a mage nearby controlling it, and he had to be at least class 5. Looking back, a vassal shouted for Lord Gerard. He said the damage was increasing rapidly and wanted to withdraw and regroup. Upon hearing this, Gerard was furious. To him, it didn't matter how many vassals perished. That became clear to the vassal, who heard it from the man's own mouth. No matter what happened, the tribute to the Marquis had to be sent. The order was to clear the path in less than 24 hours. If they failed, he would punish them. In the tower, the prince wanted to know if they had already received the gift. The red-haired girl wanted to know if he was talking about a girlfriend. The young prince replied that wasn't the case. The young woman said she wanted to receive something too. Meanwhile, someone knocked on the door and slowly entered. Layla thought that Lizard was trying to seduce the lord. She wasn't alone. She was with the captain of the knights. He informed the prince that all the baggage had been placed in the magic tower. Meanwhile, Layla made an angry face, knowing that Mage was trying to seduce the prince. He sincerely thanked the captain for the excellent work. The captain handed a box to the prince, who thanked him and asked both of them to wait outside. So the captain and Layla waited near the carriage. The young woman wanted to know why the prince was dealing with that woman. Seeing that she wouldn't get a single word from the brave soldier, she dropped the conversation. Meanwhile, inside the tower, the girl blushed over the gift she had received. It was an extremely beautiful necklace. He said it was a token of gratitude for the preparation funds she had provided. He thought it was an artifact he had found through tracking. He never thought it could be used this way. She put her hand over her mouth and reminded him that he had promised never to speak about that. Then she said that a lot of paperwork would be required for such an act, and it wasn't even certain whether permission would be granted. He said he would keep that in mind and would continue to count on her. She said she was deeply grateful. After that, she wanted to know where he had used all those explosion scrolls, asking if he was going to war. He thought the position of branch chief was no joke. Her ability to extract information was remarkable. The young man smiled and said he wasn't doing anything like that. He had just replenished what they used in the mining excavation. She didn't believe he had used such expensive scrolls just to make a few holes. Smiling, he told her they'd leave the chatting for next time, since they'd be seeing each other more often. With that said, he asked the girl to leave him alone and stop asking so many questions. She smiled and said she was already looking forward to it. Outside, anxiously, Layla waited together with the captain of the knights. He had already stored all the money he had taken. With that, the enormous debt the territory had with the count was resolved. The only question was how Gerard would react when he realized the secret funds no longer existed. Selvio, his character from the past, was no more than a weed on the roadside, giving kill orders and failing. Now he would make everyone pay for what they did, even if he had never thought about that before. Now revenge was a possibility, and it wasn't over. Meanwhile, Gerard's vassals were fighting against the stone golem. It looked like an unfair fight, placing a large metallic structure. Tied with chains, they were pulling the golem hard enough to expose its core. Now one of the experienced vassals lunged at that core to destroy it. When he did, there was a flash and a burst of stone in all directions. The stones injured several of the vassals. After everything, the path was clear, but at the cost of many lives. They were informed that the golems had been defeated. Probably about 60% of the team had sacrificed themselves. Gerard didn't care about the numbers. He only wanted the stone gates opened. Before the gates, he wanted everyone to enter. A mage handed him a crystal. He, irritated, said she was late. When he inserted the crystal into the slot, the message said the user was invalid. And since he no longer had authorized access, a countdown began from 180. Confused, the man yelled, asking what was going on. He made several attempts, but the countdown only decreased. Each time, the message appeared, invalid user, unauthorized access. The countdown was already at 95, and even then, he kept trying. He wanted to know why it wasn't working. His vassals wanted him to prioritize his own safety first and analyze the situation later. The man quickly fled the area, but was deeply outraged. Stage 1 of the interception program had been activated. The countermeasure program would summon all monsters within the designated range. That alarm blared, and several large demonic beasts began to appear. Meanwhile, inside the carriage, the three continued chatting. The prince wanted to know where Layla got that idea from. She said it was because the prince had started spreading his affection toward the mage girl. With that, he said his heart would break thinking they were judging him wrongly. Upset, he wanted to ask something. What did they think would happen if he betrayed Selvio? The young woman wanted to know why he was thinking of betraying that Viscount. The captain lost his mind upon hearing that. The prince asked if the Viscount was the type of person to forgive serious mistakes made by subordinates. Layla firmly said that he was absolutely intolerant of failures. He asked whether Gerard would meekly accept the Viscount's punishment. Layla replied that, as the prince already knew, if Gerard found out he no longer had his reserve funds, he would do anything to survive. She pointed out that he wouldn't hesitate to betray the Viscount if necessary. The prince knew that Gerard wouldn't allow himself to be taken down so easily. The two of them, just by looking at the prince, knew he was planning something on his own again. While the protagonist was wondering what the point of it all was, he felt like he was losing. On the Golda Plateau, one of the vassals reported to Gerard that thanks to the general support, they had been able to exterminate the monsters. However, the Viscount's shadow forces had been almost completely wiped out. The man yelled for another charge to be launched. He wanted the door to be opened as quickly as possible. There was no other way to open that door besides the scroll, even though that passage could no longer be used after that explosion. Still, the scroll was used, and the path was now open for Lord Gerard. Despite having a bad feeling, he hurried inside along with his vassals. When he entered, he had a terrible surprise. His gold and silver were not there. Desperate, he begged everyone to search and find the silver. He didn't want anyone standing still. Everyone scattered to search, and some found scrolls. Then they opened them. The explosion was widespread as soon as the first scroll was opened. Gerard saw the flash, and right after that, a massive explosion engulfed nearly the entire path. He wanted to know what was happening. The team that opened the scrolls wasn't the one with him. To his dismay, the mine collapsed. It seemed like a magical trap set for them. Everyone inside the mine was crushed. The man thought it was the end. At that rate, they'd all be eliminated by Viscount Celdio. Now he was sad and worried. It was time to activate the emergency plan. He told the mage he was grateful for everything he had done, but he needed to be honest. It wasn't his fault. It was just an unlucky day. With that, one of his vassals stabbed his back with a sharp object, just to keep the secret, and so removed that person from his path. The atmosphere was tense. He was sure Cape wouldn't stay quiet about this. Maybe he had already noticed something strange. He knew he had probably already gotten involved in all of it. All he could do now was follow the emergency plan. In Viscount Celdio's village, Gerard was trying to speak with him. The man sat with his back turned in his chair. He told Gerard that he had heard the story. As soon as he heard the man's voice, Gerard prostrated himself, saying he was deeply sorry. The man said he didn't want to hear those cheap words. The result was all that mattered. Gerard explained that he believed it was the work of tomb raiders. The underground passage might not have been a common one. He thought that during the process, they had accidentally triggered the security system. He said that most of the silver coins had disappeared. The man did not like hearing that at all. To reassure him, he said not to worry. After all, few raiders were capable of carrying even just a few crates. He said he had secretly offered a reward to merchants who dealt in precious metals. He claimed they would ambush those responsible. Silver coins weren't something that could be easily taken. The man was not liking what he was hearing. He was ready to stand. When he stood up, he said that as soon as they returned, they should be captured. He understood the plan, and as he spoke, he opened a drawer. He said he would pressure them as much as possible and make them cough up every last coin. The man had nothing else to say. He simply declared that Gerard would be punished. Gerard, seeing that man with a whip in hand, begged in his thoughts to be spared. However, the whip cracked through the air several times and struck that bastard's back. As the whip snapped, the man asked if he was mocking him. Gerard, crouched down, knew he had to suffer. There was no escape from that hell. The man, furious, shouted that he always knew Gerard considered the commander of the Shadow Forces an enemy. He said that because of him, the Shadow Forces, which were already useless, had now become completely unusable. Gripping the whip with rage, he declared that Gerard's petty disputes meant nothing, but if it affected the greater cause, then the story would be different, and he continued punishing him. While Gerard lay on the ground, visibly weakened and trembling, the man standing warned that he must step down from the Shadow Forces. He asked if he understood. Trembling, he answered yes. The problem now was the tribute money that had been reserved, which needed to be sent to Marcus Antonio. Now they had to inform Lord Calix's territory, which would begin the formal process. If they offered even a small amount, they would use it to cover the missing tribute. He made it clear that if that wasn't enough, they would sell the assets of Gerard's trading group. Still crouched, the man protested, saying that was wealth he had earned through hard work. The man said he hadn't forgiven him, and that he must find the silver. If he failed, he already knew what would happen. Rolling his eyes, clenching his teeth, and sweating cold, Gerard said he understood. He bowed formally and left. His subordinate, seeing Gerard leave injured, asked if he was all right. He handed him a potion to drink quickly. As soon as he drank it, the man placed a cloak over his master's back to hide the wounds. However, Gerard said he needed to use the potion on his back as well. Gerard wanted to know where Job was. The man was sorry to report, but decided he wouldn't be needed anymore. He asked if there was a replacement. The man said a desert boy had recently been added. Gerard didn't like the fact that the young man was from the desert. He didn't like people with dark skin, but he could tolerate it for now. When asked about the preparations, the young man said he had been ready for 3 days. The young man's concern was that if the executives didn't cooperate, they wouldn't be able to escape safely. He knew they had few people, and that moment was the perfect time. Gerard told the man to go to Count Shaken's estate and take anything valuable. His vassal thought that person had quickly ended the battle for family succession. A few days later, the captain came rushing to speak with Russell. Seeing the young man's concern, he asked what it was. The captain reported that Gerard had come to visit them. It seemed to be a matter of debts. Russell thought it was just as the prince had predicted, so he tasked the captain with accompanying the prince to receive Gerard. When the captain asked if he wouldn't be going too, the Viscount replied that the prince was capable of leading the territory. He didn't want his own distress to undermine the prince's authority. All he needed to do was support him. That repulsive-looking man stared at the prince, saying his physique had improved a lot. The prince looked at the man with disgust and said he didn't need unnecessary greetings. As the prince asked to get straight to the point, the man said he wouldn't stall or beat around the bush. He was there to collect the debt, as the official pressure had already begun. It had been determined that the territory could not pay the 60,000 euros, so they planned to seize anything that could be used as collateral. The prince asked what would happen if he refused. The man, being thoroughly disgusting, said he would appoint a senior officer to make sure he couldn't escape. He would request surveillance. Saying this, he pointed a finger at the prince. The captain got tense, seeing that the man had already made his move. Laughing, Gerard said it was all non-violent. Judgment was crucial when it came to recovering funds. The young man asked whether his judgment was really that necessary. However, there would certainly be a way to delay it. Tyra thought it was just as expected from his sharp mind. Maybe he could show some seriousness. He said that with a little price adjustment, things could change a bit. Everyone could tell that what he really wanted was a bribe. The prince thought he was losing something by paying off the debt. He felt that Gerard had rushed to charge him out of urgent need for money. Pointing at the man, he said he had already gathered the money, so there was no need to pretend to be composed. The man wanted to know how he had gotten so much money. The young man noticed the man's surprise, but asked whether that wasn't a good thing. Those were bearer bonds issued by the Royal Chamber of Commerce, and they were authentic. The man knew without a doubt they were real. He just didn't expect the prince to gather 60,000 in gold. With that, the man thought he could take the bonds and run. Unlike gold or silver, the bonds were legal and portable. Then the prince took a silver bar and placed it on the table. He asked if he'd like to check. It was one of 32 pieces in 420 crates full of silver bars. Gerard realized the prince was openly revealing that he knew about the theft. It was a kind of threat to report him to the count. He already knew about the plan to steal the refund money and escape. If Viscount Selvio found out, he would eliminate him. When the rumors started spreading, Viscount Selvio fled with his secret funds. He asked what the man thought would happen to him after that, and gave him two choices. He could reveal that the reserve funds had been stolen and face punishment, or betray the Viscount and flee. The man was grinding his teeth in hatred, but he lowered his head as he thought. The prince knew he was completely shaken. Now it was time to offer a bit of hope. He told the man he would help him survive and escape. The captain was watching the conversation and didn't know exactly what the prince was planning. However, Gerard said it wasn't enough to just help him escape the territory. Smiling, the young man said he would arrange solid support so no one could touch him. If he was willing to serve the prince, he should already know it was disgraceful to the most powerful men. The man said he would need stronger backing than the prince's. He asked if the prince would provide that. The young man said everything had a price. First, he needed to sign there, and then he would deliver. The man saw that it was a receipt, proving the county had fully repaid the borrowed money. Upon seeing it was backed by bearer bonds issued by the royal family, he smiled, while saying that the boy was truly terrifying and brilliant. He thought he had been fooling everyone all that time and said he would sign. Looking at the prince, he thought he shouldn't make him an enemy. He knew it was too much for him to handle. Leaving that meeting, the captain told the prince he had foreseen everything in advance. The prince knew that the most influential person was the first son of the stepmother, the first Prince Gale. The captain wanted to know if it was really okay to give up the shield they had trusted. Smiling, the prince said no one had given it up. He believed they had made a good deal for 60,000 gold. It was worth more than just money. The young man seemed to be understanding the prince's words. which, put that way, made sense. Calix went on to say that maybe the captain didn't see it at that moment, but he would understand later. Meanwhile, a terrified man called for the Viscount, saying he had something urgent to report. He was the chief of staff and was disturbing the man while he was reading. The man revealed that the top executives of the Manhuas had disappeared. Another person quickly arrived, even more anxious, saying that the headquarters had been invaded by collectors. As the man flipped through his notebook to show the Viscount that many of the shadow forces had vanished, he said that some of the instructors who were at the Gorda Highland Fortress had also disappeared. The rest were found wiped out. The man listening to everything kept flipping through his documents, while the subordinates were drenched in sweat and fear. Another person entered and said that even those who were usually discontent had joined the movement and fled. The man wanted to know where they had gone. The report stated that in the county of Shaken, a week ago, the Count's security forces raided Gerard and his group. All of them were imprisoned in the underground prison. He checked, but couldn't find Gerard. Upon hearing this, the man ground his teeth in hatred when he learned it had been confirmed that Gerard was not among them. The man continued his report, saying he tried to follow the tracks but couldn't. When that man heard Gerard was in Prince Calix's territory, it seemed to give him an idea. Now he wondered why Gerard had gone there and why he thought he could escape. He thought Gerard wouldn't be that foolish. Then, starting to laugh, he realized he had been tricked. While the man laughed, the others just stood still. However, he called the chief of staff, who trembled all over. He would have to send someone to Gorda Highland Fortress to ensure the secret remained secure. The man asked what should be checked. The Viscount said it was the silver bars. They were told the mines had collapsed and were completely buried. However, that Viscount said that was exactly why he wanted it checked in person. The Viscount also gave an order to the squad leader to bring back the trackers from the Shikan territory. The damage would be devastating if the spy's identity were discovered. He had probably already fled the territory by then. The tall man with black hair said he understood. They would halt the tracking. The Viscount figured as much. Just send a boat to monitor the Aran River. He asked the commission chief to prepare himself. He should get to know Marquez Antonio, saying that he left. At Marquez Antonio's castle, he thought that even as much of a perfectionist as he was, he made mistakes. He didn't think it was a big deal to lose a few bases. Since the incident, things hadn't been going well. Maybe they had been too hasty. The Viscount told Marquez Antonio it had been a good opportunity to eliminate Count Colin. But the Marquis believed that despite his regret, there was no going back. The police agents were chasing the man who had stolen the money. They wanted to know what had happened to the arrogant Count Calix, who let him escape. They needed to come up with a justification and declare war. That was Marquez Antonio's intent. The Viscount had the idea to use diplomatic pressure. The Marquis seemed to like the idea. Additionally, the Viscount said he had checked, and it seemed the Shikan family hadn't replaced their representative, and he was one of them. They could use him before appointing a substitute. The Marquis wanted to hear all the details. He thought he'd rather not go to war, as it hurt his wallet too much. Meanwhile, in the county, the Protagonist believed the Viscount would seek diplomatic means. That's why he spent hours going over papers to see what could be done, because by now, they must have already learned of Gerard's betrayal. The captain understood everything. It was a matter of revenge. They would use diplomacy instead of declaring war. The prince asked the captain if he knew why. He replied that it would be a diplomatic strategy. Lords almost never left their castles unless it was for war. The captain said that's why the Council of Nobles existed. They should have sent a representative there. The prince asked who was representing them. He was told it was usually Orsul Tigrim. The captain was extremely stressed as he remembered that Orsul was practically Lady Estella's right hand. That was of utmost importance, but the prince remained very calm. He thought maybe the prince had planned it all along. Smiling, the Protagonist said it was better to leave a few openings for his enemies. Otherwise, everything would be too perfect, and they'd grow desperate looking for a weakness. If they were given one, they wouldn't expect to receive an unexpected blow. In the royal capital, Siena, a city with a history spanning about 500 years, this was the capital of the noble kingdom. It was a large city with 250,000 people. The royal city was the heart of the capital, and the royal castle was where the wise King Clidio resided. It was announced that the morning session would begin, and the king asked what the first topic of the day was. "Your Majesty," they told him, "the first topic is the secession of Count Shaken's territory." He asked who would inherit the county after the loss of Count Colin, and whether the representative was present. They mentioned that Orsul Tigrim, the representative of Count Shaken, was in the room. His Majesty asked to be informed about the situation. He explained to the Marquis that the county was in disarray, which caused him anxiety. He regretted to report the forceful takeover of power by Calix Shaken using the military. He falsely accused the widowed Countess Stella of a crime, and she was imprisoned. Additionally, he sealed the Manhwa of his half-brother. His Majesty found that unusual and implied the boy might be insane. They said he attempted to take his own life, which indicated mental issues were at play. His Majesty found it suspicious that his right-hand man, Colin Shaken, had suddenly died. The Shaken County had been succeeded by Viscount Koshalin, a member of the aristocratic family. He suspected that he was trying to steal the title and favored this Calic. He knew that if he had taken power by force, he had the support of the local knights. His Majesty was displeased to learn that the authorities were following orders from a madman. The advisor struggled to say it. The Marquis considered everything the young man did to his brother and the widow to be abuse of power. Thus, he suggested summoning Prince Kelix to the capital to assess his physical and mental health. Even though the House of Lords wasn't entirely trustworthy, His Majesty agreed. He placed the investigation in the hands of the palace's administrative department. The Marquis found his decision wise and said they needed to send a witness. His Majesty called the Marquis over for a conversation, warning him about a major problem, that the king was protecting the prince and was upset that the county's influence was theirs. His Majesty didn't see that as a hard problem to deal with. His suggestion was for the Marquis to become the king's father-in-law, who became irritated at the idea of marrying off his daughter to an old dying man. His Majesty believed that maneuver would bring many rewards, and he wasn't referring to the current king. He saw this as a plan for 10 years from now, or 5 years, and the Marquis realized that he wanted to replace the king. He understood that the goal was to make Calix the king. Days later, a royal decree arrived for the Mad Prince at Count Shaken's castle. Already guessing what it was about, the prince told his advisor to go ahead and speak. He said the prince must explain his accusations to the palace as soon as possible. The goal was to determine whether his soul had been damaged when he tried to end his life. The prince understood they thought he had gone insane after losing the chance to leave. He didn't feel the need to respond and asked Russell to come up with an excuse. Everyone present was shocked when Calix defied the king's orders. The prince didn't want his sanity evaluated just because the king had ordered it. Viscount Servio knew he followed the king's commands and was likely waiting for him. He wanted the prince to die and for Granville to survive and fulfill his ambition. His advisor went crazy upon realizing they wanted to eliminate a descendant of the Shaken family. He said he would risk himself for the prince, who said he wasn't going anywhere and didn't need protection. The prince said they had already sent someone to the capital to fight for them recently. The two couldn't believe he was talking about Gerard. 2 weeks passed, and within the royal capital Elisina, we see someone rushing to speak with His Majesty. He says it's been 2 weeks, and Count Shaken has given no response to his summons. They suspect he is planning something because of that. He destroyed the mana well of the rightful heir without leaving any evidence, and he must be afraid of the retribution coming. His Majesty asks Marquis Antonio what they should do. The butler is shocked when the king seeks advice from the Marquis, leader of the aristocratic faction, and was once his mentor. Antonio tells His Majesty that he will personally investigate the situation in the county. He is grateful for the efforts of the proactive Marquis. The king is allied with political rivals, making the man wonder what will become of the new realists now. The butler begins reading the next topic the king must address, becoming completely shocked as he reads it. It's about the engagement of His Highness, the 5th Prince. Everyone present at the meeting is stunned upon hearing this, including Duke Autumor. The king knows that the Marquis' daughter is beautiful and plans to arrange her engagement to the cruel prince. Antonio says that if that were to happen, it would bring great honor to his family. People in the room realize that Marquis Antonio and the king have conspired together. The Duke says that the royal family's custom is to select women with talent or the true queen. Antonio knows no one there expected something like that to happen so suddenly. His Majesty asks if he's implying that Marcus Holstein's daughter is inferior to the others. He says royal marriages are decisions to be made by the king and queen, and the nobility should not interfere. However, the Duke agrees, but says the intent of his visit is something else. The butler wonders what Duke Autumor is trying to do, saying that the moralist faction supports the 1st prince, but the 5th is the biological son of the queen, and he notes that the king is trying to name the 5th prince, Seal, as his successor. Realizing that the moralist faction has been abandoned by the king and the base of the factions is fracturing. At that moment, the 1st prince enters the royal hall. He exclaims that he needs to bring something urgent to His Majesty's attention. The king did not summon the 1st prince, and being against him, immediately orders him to leave. Standing firm, the prince says that will only happen if the king listens to what he has to say. In response, the king asks if he is challenging his authority, but the young prince has no intention of defying His Majesty. The king shouts that he is disobeying his order and that he will not allow interference in Seal's marriage. However, the prince does not intend to get involved in Seal's marriage. It was a misunderstanding. He found relevant information on an entirely different matter. He thought it proper to inform the noble assembly and His Majesty about it. He apologizes for the inconvenience, and the king asks what he is talking about. He presents a letter from Viscount Russell Nigel, the governmental representative of the county of Shaken, shocking the king and the nobility as he's bringing up a matter already thought to be resolved. Regardless of the distance between the territory and the capital, there are matters concerning the Count of Shaken. The Duke complains about the lack of response to the king's summons and the fact that the Marquis is the lord of Viscount Selvio. He tells them to remember who sealed Kilik Shaken's mana awakening. Antonio becomes irritated and raises his voice, asking if the Duke doesn't believe his words. In that case, none of the involved parties can be appointed as mediator, since it would be unfair, and they don't trust Viscount Russell, since he may have a connection with Kilix, who is suspected of being a criminal. Furthermore, the Duke says Russell is a former member of the Blue Lions and a knight who does not tolerate injustice. He was also granted the Royal Order of Honor, and the Duke doesn't understand how a report sent by a hero could be deemed unreliable. As soon as the Duke says they are in the country of knights, the Marquis realizes he's been caught. Finally, he asks if Marquis Antonio does not trust the entire administration of the country. His Majesty tells them not to dwell on that. After all, the man didn't mean it that way. The Marquis regrets having spoken ill of Russell and tries to correct his mistake. They then decide to examine the contents of the letter and make objections afterward. Soon, the king instructs the first prince to read the letter aloud. Reading the letter, it is stated that there was an attempt to eliminate someone inside the house, and Prince Granville, to avoid execution by hanging, sealed off his own mana. Russell Nigel takes full responsibility for all punishments, and the knights agreed with him. That's why the county representative sent the report to the royal family and the House of Lords. One of the nobles at the scene asks to verify Viscount Russell Nigel's signature. Marcus Solvener served alongside him in the royal guard and recognizes the man's handwriting. Marcus Solvener represents the kingdom's military strength. He is known as the Sword of the Realm. He is very proud as a knight, and Russell is one of the true free knights he acknowledges. Even after confirming that the letter is from Russell, he becomes irritated with Antonio for having doubted him. When His Majesty sees Solvener getting involved in the matter, he realizes the balance has shifted. Marcus Antonio had wanted to dismantle the Moralist faction, which suddenly lost its leader. However, everything went wrong when the first prince appeared and became the center of attention. This will change the power dynamic, and the factions of the first prince and the other prince will clash. A new battle for the succession of power is about to begin, and they must deal with the matter of the Doshaken estate as quickly as possible. Trying to justify himself, he says he didn't want to suspect a knight like Russell Nigel. He says accusing Granville of a crime based on the words of a criminal is wrong, and that he wants more evidence. The Duke believes it's a mistake to leave the Count's title vacant for an indefinite period. Antonio says that Prince Kilix is 15 years old and lacks the skills to become a knight. He thinks Skelix should be a swordmaster since he's a high-class noble in this country. However, the Duke clearly disapproves of someone becoming a swordmaster at just 15. He justifies it by saying that Marcus Antonio himself earned that title at the age of 50. They don't think it's reasonable to make such a demand of a young prince, and to inherit a noble title of such high rank, he must rise to the level of a user. Thus, the Mad Prince will have to prove his potential in the future. Kilix will need a few years to become a Class 4 user. After all, he's only 15 now. That will take a long time, and for now, the nobility doesn't want to start a war. With the wedding preparations underway, it's likely this war will be postponed even further. At that moment, His Majesty of the Kingdom reaches a final decision. The Assembly of Nobles will create a special investigation team to examine the attempted suicide. However, this arrangement will only last until Count Kilix becomes a user. If Kilix Shaken reaches Class 4, the investigation team will be disbanded and the succession will proceed. He asks if anyone objects, and the Marquis considers the decision very wise. He says the Duke doesn't know Stelix and probably sees him only as the son of a swordsman who died young. But he knows Calypso is nothing but a fool, and there's no way he could be Class 4. Even though he finds the king's decision fair, it is extremely favorable for him. After all, Duke Ottomer would be furious if he learned he had been deceived. Either way, the Shaken Count will always be considered a nuisance, so he intends to find a way to punish him. That same evening, Servio arrives to speak with Marcus Antonio. He asks his man to summon Lanciano. He thinks it's best that the Varigad intelligence agency handles this matter. At that moment, Lanciano arrives, introducing himself to the Marquis. The Marquis tells him he has a task for him, which must be done without Viscount Servio noticing. Lanciano knows this won't be an easy mission since the Duke is very perceptive. However, he suggests Antonio hide among a pile of documents. He thinks the Duke wouldn't notice. The Marquis will leave the task to Lanciano and only wants to make the Duke suffer. The man realizes the Marquis is in an even worse mood than usual. He suggests using one of the Shadow Knights like they did last time and says he really enjoyed that. But Antonio thinks it's better to handle these tasks without getting his hands dirty. His man will arrange it for him, and on that same night at Prince Gale's castle, A man kneels and thanks the prince for his kind words. The prince says the moment was perfect when His Majesty abandoned the realist faction. He entered the hall and united them, knowing that no one else could have conceived such a plan. The subject finds it odd. It should have taken over a week for Calix to learn about that, yet he knew right away. Either way, the man needs to ensure the prince has no interest in Calix. He says he was able to foresee it because he knew the prince's methods. The first prince understands, since Viscount Servio is Marcus Antonio's advisor. He knows they're probably calm and collected at this exact moment. His advisor asks the prince not to underestimate those two. He says they dealt a strong blow, but still managed to achieve their goal. The first prince says that His Highness the Fifth Prince's engagement wasn't broken. The advisor believes there's no way to stop it, since royal marriages are at the king's discretion. The prince is glad to be able to express his concerns. He says the enemy will try to attack His Highness next, and things will get difficult. But he says there's no need to worry because he escaped the darkness and became their son. From now on, they must strengthen bonds with nobles who support the royal family and earn their trust. The first prince thinks his nickname, the Sun, is wonderful and has a nice ring to it. Moreover, he would like to add the Shaken territory to their faction. The man likes the idea, since Russell is an icon and the prince handed his letter over to the nobles who support the realists. However, imposing himself, His Highness doesn't think it's a good idea to give so much to the nobles. The prince expected that the advisor would have a better relationship with the Viscount. After all, he delivered the letter. The advisor says it's a misunderstanding. He only helped in exchange for the forgiveness of his debt. At that moment, the first prince gives him a deep and heavy look that frightens the man. He realizes that his eyes are just like Prince Calix's, as if he could see into his soul. Then the prince prepares to go to Shaken territory and requests a declaration of support, shocking the man as he realizes the prince is going personally to Shaken County. He doesn't care if they reject him. He wants Shell's supporters to face the consequences. His advisor had planned to increase his influence and make the king depend on him, and now finds his interest in Shaken territory strange. Even so, he has no reason to stop the first prince and lets him go to the county. A few days pass, and Calix's captain brings him some news. Intel says he needs to become a Class 4 user as soon as possible. Calix says he's been searching for a suitable dungeon or ruins on his map. The old man says he doesn't need to think too hard to get strong, and he'll make sure he reaches Class 4 quickly, which leaves Calix terrified of what he's about to do. At that moment, the man lifts him up like a baby. Everyone in the castle watches the prince train with the old man, making him push himself hard, run at high speed, and train sword fighting with the boy, who soon becomes exhausted and collapses to the ground. Dramatically, he feels like he's about to die from so much effort. In the morning at the castle, the old man yells at the prince loudly, telling him it's time to wake up and ordering him to hurry. Injured, Calix argues that he doesn't have enough talent and that he's going to end up dying. Annoyed, the knight says he doesn't need talent to master the art of the sword. After all, anyone can reach the class if they train with dedication, and he's living proof of that. Covered in bruises, the prince says his body can't handle the training, even though the injuries can be cured with weak potions. Calix needs to save money, because the territory's finances are thriving thanks to him. Threatening the boy, the old man says he's already rested long enough, and that now it's time for training. Our protagonist won't stop complaining about how much he hates training. The old man makes him train in combat with wooden swords. Finally, Calix manages to see the old man's sword movement, but even though he sees it, he still takes the hit and falls to the ground, nearly fainting. With determination, he decides to get out of that situation quickly and get up. He starts thinking about something he could do to improve. He remembers a girl with pink hair and thinks that might be the solution. After all, she's the strongest ally of the first prince and the most skilled person in the game when it comes to finances. However, she and the first prince haven't met yet, so he starts thinking about recruiting the girl first. The old man notices that he's distracted again and tells him they'll redo the sword training. However, the boy has something important to tell him. Scolding the boy, the old man says it is just an excuse. The training time will increase. He says he has many silver bars they're not using, but the old man says they're practically stolen. Knowing they can't use that money without drawing attention, Calix realizes he needs someone to help with money laundering. Even thinking he's just making excuses to slack off, the old man doesn't think he's wrong about the silver bars, so he asks if they need to deal with that right now. Calix says that if they loan the silver bars to someone, the interest will be 200,000 in gold. To gain that compound interest, they need to fix the financial mess of the county. Russell understands what he's saying and asks how long it will take. Our prince thinks it'll take 3 months because he'll have to go to the capital. He then concludes that this is enough time. Russell will inform Kraut of the daily tasks he must fulfill. When the boy says he doesn't need to go that far, Lord Russell snaps at him. The next day, Kraut calls the prince's attention. saying that the first prince is suddenly coming to their castle. The knight heard during the vassals' meeting that a battle for succession between the first and fifth prince had begun. Because of that, the first prince is coming to take their territory. Suddenly, the boy starts cleaning up the mess quickly, complaining to the knight that he hadn't heard any news about the first prince's arrival, telling him to prepare the horses, not the carriage, because they'll depart in 2 hours. Kraut says he doesn't even know how to ride a horse yet. Calix says he'll figure it out while they're on the move and tells him not to complain, just get the horses ready. After all, he'll leave first, and then Kraut will follow, who asks if he doesn't want to meet the prince. The boy says he's never seen him in person before, and there's a reason for that. Out of all the people who played Hero's Destiny, there isn't a single one who doesn't know Gale Rotchik Kledio Krakow. He's one of the few hero-tier characters in the game. The first prince is famous for recruiting talented people, so if he stays in the castle, the first prince will forcibly make him a subordinate. That's one of the options, or he'll be executed or worked to death, and that's why he decided to run. When Kraut hears about being left behind, he's slightly shocked. Russell scolds the red-haired knight harshly for letting the young master leave on his own, even though he insisted that the prince wait for him. 2 hours pass, and the protagonist ends up waiting for the knight, who is very late. Suddenly, he gets upset by the attitude of a pink-haired girl. He says that thanks to Calix's efforts, their pursuers no longer have time to bother with her. The power of the shadows has been reduced, and there are many deserters like her. When the young man asks where she plans to go, the girl says she hasn't decided. Even though she always dreamed of that kind of freedom, now that she has it, her mind is blank. Lyra decides she'll go wherever she wants for an indefinite amount of time, and the young man recognizes the pink-haired girl. The young prince thinks to himself, if he had the chance, he would go to the Holy Empire of Granada. Lyra asks if that place has artifacts and mana manipulation techniques for women. The prince says it's fine as she doesn't believe him and she can do whatever she wants. She thanks him and says that if there's a chance, they'll meet again. Calixto agrees and says it's a shame he can't do more for her, even knowing that Lyra isn't a high-level talent or someone with special abilities. The two say goodbye, and the girl rides off on her horse. Calix hopes to meet her again and have a second chance. After that, he walks toward a grave in a cemetery. Al died in the most honorable way possible. That makes the young ones wonder if he was too calculating, because this young soldier gave his life for him, and even so, he didn't stop Lyra, because her status window showed a maximum level. He considers the possibility of viewing these people as game characters, promising himself that next time he wants the encounter to be more human. Then he leaves Al the soldier's grave behind. Realizing he left his knights waiting, he leads them on their mission. 3 days later, they arrive at the border of the Shaken territory. Prince Gale and his group were spotted by the county, arriving with their carriages. That same night, the first prince sat at their dinner table, thanking them for the excellent wine, the incredible place, and the amazing people present, commenting that the new successor is absent from his own territory. The advisor apologizes and says the prince's messenger arrived a few days after his departure. The first prince asks why he left the territory and gets an unsatisfying response. If he asks again, it'll seem like he's pressing too hard. But thinking the old man doesn't know how to read the room, he insists, saying he needed to see Calix. He asks Lord Russell not to take it the wrong way. He was also eager to meet him. Lord Russell raises his glass and says he's honored in the prince's presence. Then the boy decides to get straight to the point and asks for the Lord's support. He asks if he can reconcile with Viscount Koshelin, who thinks they're allies. After all, he delivered the letter to the king in person. Lord Russell bows his head and thanks the prince for his help, who then asks how he met Gerard. Even though Gerard already told the prince, he wants to hear Russell's version, and quickly gets irritated with the Viscount for treating him like someone who hasn't received reports from subordinates. Meanwhile, Russell gets frustrated that he can't figure out his true intentions, that the prince was sick when he received the royal summons, so he sent the message explaining their delay. The first prince asks if there was a problem with the mounted messenger on the road. The Viscount said he tripped over a stone and broke his ankle, and said he was having trouble explaining that. At that moment, Gerard came to make an offer to the Viscount, asking for help so he could escape from Servio, and if he did that, he would forgive all of House Shaken's debts, as well as take care of the message that couldn't be sent to the royal capital. At that time, Gerard asked for the letter and Russell didn't think things would end this way. The young prince stares into Russell's soul and sees nothing suspicious so far, which to him is a shame, because even though the Lord is a respected knight, he has no other talents. He concludes that Gerard decided to flee and the Viscount was just there at the right time. From what he's heard about Calix, he's sick and shouldn't be a concern. Either way, he needs to secure his support, demanding Lord Russell's answer about supporting the first prince. The Viscount feels an enormous pressure on his shoulders. He formally declares support for first Prince Gale in the name of House Shaken, who smiles, seeing that he's achieved his goal. However, the Viscount reveals that they have a request for the young prince. After all, 3 days ago, Calix had already mentioned the support Gale would be asking for, stating that they cannot support the fifth prince seal, because Marcus Antonio is the stepfather and guardian of the fifth prince. Even though supporting the first prince won't earn them anything in return, they have no choice. Still, they will declare support for him and make sure to take a firm stance. The only demand is that he request a transit tax exemption for the guilds in the territory. Russell comments that they don't have any royal merchant guilds in their territory. Even though they were dissolved due to finances, Calix wants to change that. With the entire country split into two groups, the first prince's influence will reach Seal's faction, which will be enough if applied only to regions under his influence. As for the amount, it should be limited to 1,000 magical artifacts per year, and the prince will agree. Even without a transit tax, the territories will still pay separate customs taxes. The Viscount doesn't understand how effective that will be, and the prince tells him to do as instructed. Agreeing with the young master, he imagines there must be an unconventional plan in mind. The first prince says Russell is free to speak his mind. No matter what it is, he will do it, and the Lord notices that it's just as Calix had said. The next day, the young prince feels extremely tired from the journey. Encouraging him, the redhead says they're close to reaching Posnu, and that the pain young people feel is just from not being used to riding horseback. Kraut understands that the young master is only 12 years old, which is a sensitive age. Our protagonist really wants to punch the original owner of this body in the face. Then he asks what they're going to do in Posnu since they should be heading to the capital. Calix says is to avoid running into the first prince on the way, and Kraut wants to know why he's so afraid of him. The young prince is shocked by the question and says he isn't afraid of the first prince. Even so, Kraut asks what he's doing if he's not running away. The prince said they were going to stop in Posnu on the way back from the capital, but the plan changed. But he assures them he's not fleeing from the prince, and the redhead notices how agitated he is, finding him small and cute, though the protagonist gets annoyed at being treated like a child. After all, he needs to reach class 4, but with Russell's training, it'll take an eternity. And that's the real reason they're in Posnu, because he plans to clear the dungeon near the city to obtain a level 5 skill. Dungeons with good rewards are quite rare. Even if they exist, his body is weak, and clearing such a place requires a large team. If they did that, the nobles from the dungeon's territory wouldn't stay quiet and would accuse them of theft. In Posnu it's different, as the city is free and has no meddling nobles, so they can hire mercenaries. The young red-haired knight points to the city of Posnu as it comes into view. They finally arrive at the free city and join a single line with their horses. The city knights ask them to fill out a visitor registration form before entering. Our protagonist and his allies arrive at the inn and leave the horses at the stable. Thanking them for their hard work during the journey, he says they can rest before setting out. He asks his knights if they know any good places, and they get excited. Cross refuses the idea of resting, but everyone else gets excited. They stroll through the city and say they would love to have a place like that in their own territory. A pink-haired boy welcomes them and says everyone is free to enter his bar. He claims it's the best place in town to drink a lot of alcohol. Even though all the knights find it strange, he sits at a table in the tavern and they start eating and drinking. Kraut doesn't take a single sip, while the other knights are drinking since the prince allowed it. The redhead says that if anything bad happens to the young master, he needs to stay sober. At that moment, the young master catches the attention of the pink-haired boy with the barret. For some reason, the boy looks at him with a bit of fear, sweating nervously. Our protagonist asks the pink-haired girl if there's a quieter place. She says there is, but warns that if she takes the prince to another store, she'll get in trouble. She says that if the soldiers are having fun there, he only needs to go with one more person. She offers to take him somewhere else in exchange for a gold coin. Impressed by the real gold coin, she accepts the offer. She just asks to leave the other soldiers there drinking. Our protagonist agrees and brings his loyal squire Kraut with him. Meanwhile, the girl in the barret tells them to follow her as they cross the city. Calix asks how long she has been in the city, and the girl says it's been over 10 years. However, the prince says she doesn't even look like she's 10, and she replies that she's 14. He then asks who the most powerful person in Posnu is. The girl replies it's Omar, a fighter and leader of the Steel Shield mercenary group. But in reality, he's never faced the 3 great mercenary leaders, so it's just a rumor. He asks who the 3 biggest mercenary groups are. The girl realizes he doesn't know them and introduces the Red Wolf, the Black Wing, and the Steel Shield. Together, these are known as the 3 great mercenary groups. Calix asks about the monster wave in the fall, and the girl says the damage wasn't too bad. However, the adults are worried about the possible arrival of the super moon. The girl says the young master doesn't seem that old, but he's mature for his age. They finally arrive at a huge mansion. However, a woman says they don't have a reservation and asks what they're doing there. Calix says the child brought them there. The woman realizes Yurine is causing trouble again. The woman apologizes but says they're closed for the day and asks them to leave. Our protagonist starts staring at the woman, who gets confused, until she realizes that the blonde young man is staring at the ring on her finger. Seeing that her response wasn't appropriate, he asks Yurine to return the tip. The girl says she guided him correctly and doesn't need to return the coin. Yurine says the prince isn't looking for women but for information, so she won't give the coin back. But the woman scolds the girl with a stern look to make her return the coin. Reluctant and trembling, the girl considers getting the coin back. Our hero accesses the pink-haired girl's information through the game system. He realizes he has found the shadow sorceress, Celestina Yurine. The only reason for his trip was to meet the future top merchant. He planned to invest the stolen secret funds with her and happened to find Celestina by chance. Seeing that this place is where he'll get the information, he says she doesn't need to return the coin. But Celestina's adoptive mother orders her to come at once, threatening her with arrows. Cross draws his sword, but Celestina runs toward the woman. Angrily, the knight asks who she's pointing those arrows at. The woman says that in a high-class place, uninvited guests must leave. She notices that the guests have combat skills like knights and feels forced to take drastic measures. But if they leave now, nothing will happen. The young master says she won't gain allies by refusing to talk to anyone who shows up. Celestina Yurine says the authoritarian woman is overreacting. She may have eternal beauty, but she doesn't seem wiser than the little girl. The woman knows better than anyone how talented Yurine is, and she knows she can't reveal their real identities. Accepting the offer, she asks who the young man is and what his name is. The confident boy thinks she should already know that. Then he tells her to take the ring off her finger and hand it to the girl Celestina. The woman asks if the young master knows the meaning of the ring. In response, he says that the royal seal of Agrippina is openly engraved on him. Our protagonist mocks her, saying he's easily recognizable because of the ring. Annoyed, the woman threatens him, points a crossbow at him, and calls him Prince Calix. They scold a woman who should have said his name earlier since she already knew. Then the protagonist says that's the reason he found this place. He says he needs information and can offer something in return. However, the woman can't answer that. Only the royal family could identify who they are because of the crests on the rings, or a criminal. But for an heir of a count's family to figure it out instantly is strange. The prince knows she's confused and demands an answer from her. He asks Celestina what she thinks about it. After all, the more complex the problem, the simpler the answer. The girl says the young master is smart and never forgets what he sees, especially since the royal crest appears in many history books and he must have seen it before. She says it's just the crest of a royal family that went extinct a long time ago. The woman gets angry when Yurine says that. The young master acknowledges that she's very intelligent, and Celestina finds him admirable. Watching the two talk, the authoritative woman says this is too exposed a place, and invites them to enter the mansion. She is cordial with them, and the protagonist notices it's a place where you can drink, gamble, and then sleep. Still, being in a hall with a woman is a little tense for him. At that moment, the woman says she hasn't decided whether to let him leave safely, and asks if he shouldn't try to convince her otherwise. The young master remarks on the lack of hospitality since she didn't even offer him tea. The woman claps her hands, and her servants bring tea. In the family game, Celestina is a member of the Children of Eridona, a dark group. She was the most powerful ally who financed the Black Prince Gale. No one surpassed her ability to make money. That's why the young man plans to invest all the stolen money with her. However, she's still too young for that and should be allowed to grow more. Or he has the option of raising her himself. While sipping tea, the woman asks if he hasn't considered the possibility that it's poisoned. In response, the master says that if it were, he would know. They return to the subject of negotiations, and she asks for secrecy to build trust. Without agreeing to the secrecy of the conversation, the protagonist offers 100,000, stating that he will invest 100,000 gold, asking only for the guarantee that she won't steal his money and run away. A woman appears and says that's too much money to refuse. The matriarch says that Lady Yurine shouldn't be there. She formally introduces herself as a former member of the royal family Agrippina of the Jaipur Union, introducing herself as Celestia Yurine and stating that right now she's just a fugitive. That's why she says they can simply call her Yurine. Our protagonist is impressed that she's not acting like a child and is behaving differently, noticing that she's only a year older than the body he's possessing, and now feels free to no longer hold back. Then the young master asks if becoming a princess doesn't guarantee the ability to make money. Celestia says she has a network of fugitives, which allows her to gather information quickly, and that the basis of business is buying low and selling high. And the young man asks if there isn't too much competition, besides the lack of guarantee that rival merchants will play by the same rules. After all, they have powerful backers and can block goods at customs and find excuses to confiscate products, and Celestia says every business has risks. stating that they can also deal with smuggling. However, our protagonist says it needs to be a legalized business, because the goal of the venture is to bring it into the light, and proving the origins would be hard otherwise. Celestia suggests they'd be stolen goods, but the prince says they won't be stolen goods, they'll be compensation for emotional damage. And the most important thing is that he wants a guarantee she won't run away with his money. The girl says that's simple. After all, she'll be the young master's hostage. The authoritative woman is shocked by Yurine wanting to be his hostage. Celestia tells her stepmother that 10 years have already passed since their people began wandering foreign lands. If it continues like this, the organization will collapse and turn into a group of criminals. 100,000 is a huge sum and will ensure the well-being of their people, and she doesn't care about her position. The stepmother gets tired of pretending and starts screaming at Princess Yurine with intense hatred. Calyx doesn't care about the past, and if Yurine wants to be queen, she must return to the kingdom of Jaipur. Celestia agrees with the young master. At that moment, she renounces the name Agrippina and cuts her hair with a knife, leaving everyone in the hall shocked by her renunciation of the princess title. Seeing that the prince has an idea of the business he intends to undertake, and he agrees with Celestia Yurine. He originally planned to leave everything in her hands, but she's still too young for that. Until she gains that trust, the young master will guide the girl. Yurine says he doesn't look any older than her. The prince notices she's more mature than he expected. However, he has no intention of treating her like an adult, since Yurine is still a child, and says he needs to provide the capital, and she will be the one to operate the business using someone else's money, so the age difference will be irrelevant. Celestia asks him to share the plan with her anyway. Before that, he intends to address the main goal, where he first needs information. The stepmother tells her to provide all the information they have, including about the 3 factions. Our protagonist notices that just moments ago she was interacting as a mother would, very capable of separating her public and private life. Then she takes the protagonist to a room full of the information he needs. Decided, our hero begins to analyze everything carefully. He stays up all night at the mansion, and isn't concerned about convincing Yurine to increase the capital. He just wants to conquer the dungeon. There's the option of going to the dungeon with the elite members he brought, or hiring new mercenaries for that. Hiring too many increases the risk of leaking secrets, so he prefers to use the elite group. He also has to hire a mage, since he's not just another fighter. He changes a group's entire tactic, multiplying its strength. That's why mages are so valuable and expensive. He can't even believe there's a class 6 mage living in Posnio. His name is Edelin Beltua, the Hermit of Life, and he needs more information about him. When the prince tries to call the girl, her stepmother says she's in class. A servant asks him to follow her as she prepared snacks and tea for him, and once Celestia Yurine's class is over, she'll bring the girl to speak with him. Our hero realizes that Edelin Beltua is a class 6, just like Viscount Russell. The Shekin territory used to be just a barony until this generation, until the appearance of Count Colin, Calyx's father. Colin Shekin reached class 7 when he was young but passed away soon after becoming count. While he's not even the official heir of the Shekin family yet, he wonders if a class 6 mage would really join him. He's willing to try to make it happen. Celestia Yurine appears at this moment, asking about the start of the business and where the capital is. They need the right preparations before launching the business he planned, which will take about 6 months or even up to a year. He asked Yurine to calm down in the meantime, showing the balance certificate issued by the Mage Tower. It has 30,000 deposited. The girl is surprised because the letter is authentic and contains 30,000 in gold bars. She considers it fair, the 100,000 gold he asked for, given the size of Shekin territory. Our protagonist doesn't like being called Big Brother by her, but the girl says she calls everyone she does business with that, and asks if there's a problem. The real reason he called Celestia there was to ask about Edelin Beltua. The stepmother appears and says Edelin is suspected of being a dark mage. However, Celestia says he's not a dark mage. She told him to be careful with him, as he might make absurd demands of help. However, the prince already knows Edelin Beltua very well. He has a difficult personality, but he's not a bad person, and the prince decides to take responsibility. Still, the stepmother doesn't want to reveal his location, which irritates Calyx. Then she gives the location of a cemetery in front of the mountains, where there's a cabin. In that small cabin lives a mortician who is the mage Edelin himself. Everything known about him is written in the report from his arrival years ago. He rarely leaves and is obsessed with his experiments, which Calyx wants to know about. But mages hate having their research secrets exposed. Afraid, Celestia asks if he's really going to the old man's house. Our protagonist says he hasn't done anything wrong and asks why she's afraid. Yurine tells him not to accept any tempting offer from the mage who will try to suck his money dry. She tells him not to touch the money he's planning to invest because that money belongs to her. Before the princess can tell the story involving Edelin, the break comes to an end. She's dragged back to her room by her stepmother. Our protagonist plans to find the mage and convince him to join the team. They pass through the north gate of Posnio, arriving at the community cemetery. Finally reaching the cabin, they knock on the door and ask if anyone is home. The two notice that the door is open and decide to enter. Our hero realizes that whoever lies there isn't afraid of monsters or bandits. He doesn't know who's inside, but he knows it's someone confident. Upon seeing the potions in the cauldron, he imagines it must be a dark mage. He had heard of him before, but seeing Edelin Belchua up close is very different. He introduces himself as Calix Shekin. The mage says he doesn't understand worldly things or the importance of the boy's name. Calix tells him not to worry, that it's just a famous family with lots of irrelevant titles, and even if it were relevant, it couldn't compare to someone who reached Archmage level. Edelin is too busy and doesn't have time to play with the prince. If he doesn't get straight to the point, he'll be kicked out of his house. Our protagonist says he plans to conquer the region's dungeon and asks to borrow the mage's power. The dark mage asks if it's the Impalan Mountain Range dungeon. As soon as our hero confirms, the mage reacts badly, saying it's been a long time since he's seen such a crazy brat. Seeing his master insulted, Croc gets angry but holds himself back, knowing it would be madness to attack an archmage. Our hero says he won't spare any expenses for his reward, but the archmage asks what he truly has to offer. When our hero mentions money, the mage says it only has value if he survives, saying he should go back home if he values his life. Desperate, the prince says he can get something for Edelin's research. Startled, the mage asks if he came from the magic tower to investigate his research. Irritated and putting pressure on the two boys, he tells them to get out of his house. The two leave and return to the mansion upset. Celestia asks if the investment capital was stolen, and the protagonist says the mage didn't even want money. The girl thought he used it as an excuse to interfere, so she begins to explain that shortly after old Edelin arrived, she invested money with him, and after that, the old dark mage scammed her. They're both shocked because the mage stole money from a child for his research. Our protagonist asks her to show the contract, and the girl hands it over. The contract was for an investment of 30 gold, equivalent to 6 years of crossed salary. They ask how she stayed so calm after such a heavy blow, but the girl is still distressed over the loss. In truth, the girl is feeling very bad about losing her 30 gold, saying that it's her money and she spends it however she wants, and she curses the old mage. Our protagonist offers to take over the contract for her, but the girl refuses, wanting to make old Edelin work until he repays what he owes her. Calix says that might work on an ordinary person, but not on a level 6 mage. The girl gets sad, seeing no way to recover her money. Our hero says she chose to invest her money and accepted the risk of losing it too. If she were strong enough to demand payment from the mage, then she might succeed. The girl criticizes our protagonist, saying he's not stronger than Edelin. In response, he says he's a noble with a territory of his own and a lot of money. When the girl calls him a child, he almost reveals the truth. Realizing he was immature for getting angry at a child, he stops. Even though he sees the girl as a genius, she's far too inexperienced, and the fact that she thinks a contract can control a level 6 mage is naive. He believes she should accept the loss when an investment fails, and know how to seize any opportunity to recover that same money. If she went through the trouble of drafting a contract, she must know the subject of the old mage's research, and she must also know where all her money went. Our protagonist offers to help her in exchange for 50 gold, which would yield her a 67% profit in a few years. The girl agrees but wants to see everything up close in return. However, they become disheartened upon seeing the amount of material related to the contract. At that moment, Celestia Urine's stepmother shows up to see what they're doing. They try to hide it and come up with an excuse, but the girl doesn't disguise it very well. The stepmother gets very angry upon seeing that she made an agreement behind her back, going against her. In response, the girl says the stepmother refuses everything she asks for. To punish the girl, she takes her to supplementary classes that will be longer than usual. Even so, the two remain in the room with the documents, and continue researching what interests them both, enough material to convince Edelin to enter the dungeon with them. Waking Kraut, he says they're heading out. Our protagonist decides to hire mercenaries for a task. Walking through the city in search of mercenaries, they see many strange faces, until they finally arrive at the mercenary negotiation office. Inside, they are met with strange looks. People find it odd that a high-ranking noble is coming to hire mercenaries. The receptionist finds it unusual and calls a manager to handle it. The manager of the place thanks them for the visit. Our hero immediately notices that this man is not an ordinary person. As the man guides them into a room, Calix says that class 4 or higher mercenaries are rare. The man says that a fighter who reaches a high skill level and finds a rural area usually becomes a knight. Kraut feels it's a jab at him and gets annoyed. However, many prefer freedom and choose to stay rather than become knights. He's surprised that the prince came himself, as he could have sent a representative. But the prince says sending a representative wouldn't guarantee a proper contract. Even though he's young enough to be the man's grandson, he notices the prince is sharp and asks for a more detailed explanation of the request. Our protagonist says the danger level is high and the reward is twice the average salary, stating that an S-rank mercenary will act as commander and have full authority over the expedition. The maximum number of people for the assault is 120, and for support 80. The manager of the establishment realizes that even though he's a child, he must not be underestimated. The man notes that he withheld the details of the mission but presented the conditions clearly, and conditions that are perfectly balanced. However, it would seem strange to accept so easily, but even so, he cannot refuse. So he tells the prince that finding a group of mercenaries willing to accept all terms will take some time. Our hero will give more details if the man is willing to accept a smaller reward. The experience and negotiation skills he's built so far are nothing compared to the thousands of times he's done this in the game, concluding that the man is an amateur who accepts his conditions as they are. After all, he's never met a figure like Kalik Shekin before and extends his hand, only asking that he do his best to ensure the mercenaries come back alive. Our protagonist promises to do so. The man says he can send the captain of the mercenaries to the young master's inn. Then they'll discuss the details with the captain of the mercenaries who take the request. He bids farewell to the manager of the establishment, and his companion asks if something's wrong, while the prince feels relieved because he thought they would refuse. Kraut finds his negotiation skills incredible and asks where he learned that. Our protagonist doesn't reveal the truth about having been a sales director at his previous job. When he mentions getting a drink, the knight says he's not old enough for that yet. A hooded figure observes all of this. He says it's not unusual for people to go to a mercenary agency, but nobles with bodyguards are strange. Feeling the need to investigate this further, he follows the prince. Pozniew is the only free city in the kingdom of Roke that is not affected by the rules of nobility. Precisely for that reason, it's famous for being a sanctuary for mercenaries. The moment someone joins them, their records are erased, even if they're criminals or nobles. In exchange, any mercenary affiliated with Pozniew must fight in the monster wave from the Impalan Mountains. Every autumn, they come in large numbers year after year. These monsters are either defeated by the mercenaries or turn them into a feast. At first, the burden didn't fall only on the mercenaries. It was also placed on the front line of defense, which consisted of a battalion of criminal prisoners. Since their deaths meant no compensation would be paid to their families, the current system of the Free City was built on this foundation. Over time, they transformed into the Blackwing Mercenary Group, and in the future, they came to control both the entertainment district and the criminal underworld. In a room in the city, we see the Blackwing Mercenary Group. Walter is the underworld boss in Pozniew. At this moment, he's speaking with Corvus and saying he's very bold to show up there. Corvus says that considering the past, he should be hunting Walter's head. Corvus left the past behind as a dark knight and asks Walter to stay calm. Walter is furious because he's been receiving high-level requests as a Dark Knight, and he wonders how someone like Corvus, a piece of trash, reached Class 6. The Dark Man says a group of nobles arrived in the city a few days ago, but the underworld boss knows nothing about that. However, the Dark Knight mentions they placed a request with the mercenaries. So the Shadowy Knight asks Walter to investigate the group and says he wants to be paid. Corvus will pay him up front to start the investigation and will give more if he finds out everything, saying that if he misses this chance, he'll lose a big payout. Walter orders his men to bring everything they have on that group. Moments later, they gather all the documents for their boss. As soon as the boss starts reading, he is shocked to see the noble wants to start a war. One of the men says the threat level is A with a duration of 3 months, and he wants 200 men. So he doesn't want to start a war or declare territorial dispute, but it's still an A-rank mission. He thinks it's normal to take elite teams, not a mercenary army, and wonders if it's a monster hunt. The hooded man thinks that would be a guaranteed loss. Walter agrees and asks why they don't just finish them off all at once. Walter asks why not get rid of the noble right away. Corvus says there's always someone walking with him, a Class 5 knight. Even though he's Class 6, he doesn't want to try eliminating the boy because it would leave traces, and if he manages to use a return scroll in the meantime, it'll be an even bigger problem. Even if it's difficult, Corvus is waiting for the perfect opportunity. For now, he decides to assume the boy's target is the dungeon and act accordingly. They have no time to lose. Once inside the dungeon, even a scroll will be useless. Walter plans to use this moment to get rid of the noble and deal with the mercenaries he hired. He hands over a reward to the underworld boss and says that if this leaks, it'll be a problem. The boss wants additional payment for this job since there are at least 100 mercenaries he'll have to face. Even if it were just one mercenary, the number can't be ignored, and it's a dungeon with no exit. Corvus is willing to pay whatever it takes because the one who hired him has a lot of money. In Pozniew, there are 3 major mercenary groups known as the 3 Great Forces. They are the Blackwing Mercenaries, the Steel Shield, and the Red Wolf. Among hundreds of factions, they stand out because of their overwhelming power. They didn't start as a bunch of bounty hunters who teamed up by chance. The Blackwing Mercenaries were once convicts used as human shields against monsters. The Steel Shield Mercenaries were their jailers, the guards who suppressed their revolts. So the two groups hated each other and had avoided direct confrontation until now. That was because both feared an ambush from the Red Wolves, and all three were balanced in strength. Pozniu had maintained a balance of power, preserving a false peace in the city, and both groups were always keeping a close watch on each other. The slightest sign of military mobilization would raise alarm. It seems they're finally going to settle things once and for all through confrontation. We see a conversation at the headquarters of the Steel Shield Mercenaries, where a man says he received intel that the Blackwings are secretly organizing. A blue-haired man is shocked, and the other says they need to prepare. Meanwhile, our hero says Celestia Urine can't go with him. She says that since she's a hostage, he should take her wherever he goes. The prince hasn't even invested in her yet and tells her to wait at the mansion. The girl insists he take her along on the mission and says he might regret it. The protagonist is annoyed by her confidence, knowing he's going to give in. He allows her to go up to the dungeon entrance and wait there, and finds it even stranger that she's satisfied just going to the dungeon's entrance. Her stepmother appears, saying it's insanity to take a girl to a dangerous dungeon. Calyx says she's not a hostage yet and insisted on going along. The stepmother says that besides being a princess, she's still a child and he shouldn't allow it. Completely opposed, the woman does not allow the princess to go with him. At that moment, he realizes he didn't make a good first impression and that the stepmother doesn't like him. He wonders if anyone would be a good match for Harry. After all, she's beautiful and takes good care of Urine. Maybe if she found something to lean on, she would calm down a bit. While all this happens, Corvus spies on the whole conversation from behind a tree. The mercenaries talk about Lady Harry going to the dungeon because of the princess. They regret not having kicked the noble out when he first came around. Handing over a sack of money, he tells the man to keep watching the nobles, and says the prince must have seduced Celestia and lured her in with promises of wealth. A hooded man says he didn't like him from the moment he saw him. He asks for his orders, and the hooded man says they can't allow the princess to be taken into the dungeon. After all, a dungeon isn't something that can be cleared just by adding more people. This mercenary feels a tension in the air and knows that Steel Shield and Black Wings are bound to clash. The hooded one thinks they should use this mission to pull back and observe, then return to eliminate the victor or negotiate with him as if they knew nothing. They agree this is the best decision. Meanwhile, the person sent by the mercenary office enters the prince's room. Introducing himself as Trias, he asks that all matters regarding the group be directed to him. He also shows the S-rank credit guarantee issued by the office. He says he can handle the selection of fighters and other services as well. However, Prince Calyx finds Trias a bit suspicious and says nothing, but he's glad to have found the right person so quickly. He then says there's nothing wrong and tells him to bring more people than usual. He understands the master wants to inspect them before deciding, but there's a contract fee for those not chosen. Our protagonist agrees and says he'll pay if necessary. On top of that, he asks Trias to provide the items he requested. It's a list of essential items for exploring the area, and each person must find at least one item on the list. Only Trias is allowed to know all the items on the list to maintain secrecy. The mercenary representative only wants to know how the young prince found this city. He asks if Prince Calyx has a favorite hostess. This makes our protagonist realize he already likes Harry and doesn't need to introduce them. After that, he says he was looking for a quiet place and happened to meet the girl who introduced him to the area. Even hesitant at first, he was surprised by how peaceful the place was and decided to rent it for a while. Trias pretends he asked without reason and is glad they don't have ulterior motives toward Madame Harry. He then asks if the young master is considering hiring more mercenaries. From his experience, there are two types of A-rank missions: an unwinnable battle, or a dungeon expedition. Our hero assumes he knows that he's not planning to start a war, but at the same time, he probably doesn't know anything about the dungeon he plans to explore. Assuming he knows nothing about the scale or ranking of this dungeon, seeing that he suggested hiring more people, he realizes the monsters aren't the main threat in that place, but rather the looters chasing after treasure. Trias says it'll cost a bit more, but hiring more mercenaries will be worth it, asking him not to underestimate them and assuring that if they have more people, no one will dare attack them. Our protagonist has no intention of doing that, as his enemies are not the three great powers. The chief is trying to tell him that the mercenaries might dare to hurt the noble, but he's afraid of insisting too much and having the prince terminate their contract. He realizes he'll have no choice but to escape with Urine and Madame Harry. He decides to review the contract details and the newly added item request. It indicates that they need to gather almost twice the number of people initially required, and to maintain secrecy, each individual will be responsible only for their own task on the item list. Calix agrees with everything he said and intends to see where it all leads. The next day, in an open field near the outskirts of Pozny Castle City, as instructed, Trias managed to gather a total of 260 people, and acknowledges that even with the noble's dramatic warnings, it was an impressive feat. Immediately, our protagonist points at one man and tells him to leave. Then he points at several others and begins dismissing them all. The mercenary chief tries to warn him that they are more persistent than expected. Even so, the prince orders them to keep an eye on those resisting too much, as they are likely spies. In shock, Trias asks how he can be so sure. Calix says that if they were real mercenaries, they'd be happy to skip a dangerous mission and still get paid for it. But if they were paid by someone else and don't join them, they'll have to return the money, so they keep insisting. Our protagonist is completely sure that this is what's happening, and Trias understands. He thinks they may have gotten rid of all the pawns and reduced the risk of information leaks, and hopes everything will go well now during the dungeon expedition, mounting his horse and leading all the bounty hunters to follow him. But at that moment, Celestia Urine appears on her horse and asks if he liked the gift. He thanks her because if it weren't for the girl, he wouldn't have known that the three great powers wanted him dead. She said they're in the same business and can't let him be eliminated in the dungeon. Thanks to Celestia's personal contact, he received a great shield bearer, Trias. At that moment, the girl asks if he's okay about the monster issue in the Impalan mountain range. Calix says that it's like his backyard, even though he was raised in Shekin territory. After all, he used to walk around there all the time in his dreams. The mercenary chief asks the young master what the final destination is, stating that the area is full of monsters and they can't proceed like this. So he asks the master for permission to send scouts, and he immediately refuses. Then he asks Crowd to do something, but the knight obeys his lord, and wonders how many mercenaries might die because of the noble's stubbornness. If the losses are too great, they'll have to retreat, and he needs a way to save the core members of the group. At that moment, Prince Calix tells Kraut to climb a tree and survey the surroundings. With a huge leap, he climbs the tree and spots a goblin village 500 meters away. The master silently orders the goblins to be wiped off the face of the earth. However, the knight says the smell of tomato sauce could attract larger monsters. Calix says if he leaves ketchup at the site after defeating the goblins, he might as well give up being a knight. Trias is shocked by the knight's precision in spotting goblins from such a long distance. Looking the other way, Kraut sees several orcs in huts 400 meters away. Realizing there are only a few, he orders them all to be exterminated and not allowed to escape. The mercenary chief thinks this must be a coincidence because the knight is extremely accurate, and he also spots gnolls to the north and northwest at a farther distance. Trias is even more stunned by the red-haired knight's unusual skill.
Our video ends here. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, bye bye.